John stood on the windswept hill, the soles of his boots buried in melting snow that clung to the early spring grasses. Dawn had not yet spread its full splendor across the horizon, but the faint, pale light revealed the shape of the world. The landscape below was a vast stretch of frosted fields stretching northward, touched by bleak patches of rock, where the winter storms had scoured away the topsoil. Here and there, thin streams shimmered in the half-light, meandering between steep banks, their waters slowed by lingering ice. It had been only a few days since he parted ways with the Unsullied near the mouth of the Trident. Fewer still since he had heard news, half rumor, half legend, of Drogon's flights through the northern skies. Some claimed to have seen the beast's silhouette skimming the edge of the horizon in the shape of a thundercloud. Others said they'd heard an otherworldly cry in the night, a roar that shook the bones. No one could say for certain, but for John the rumor had been enough. He felt haunted by the memory of that creature's majesty, and of course, by Daenerys. It was impossible not to think of her when he thought of Drogon. The Black Dragon had once been her mightiest child, fearsome and loyal, and now, somehow, free. John pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders, letting out a slow breath that turned to steam in the frigid air. The wall loomed in his mind, a shattered relic to the north. Word had reached him that after the Great War and the strife in the south, no new defenders had yet mustered the resources or courage to rebuild it. Scattered bands of free folk, remnants of the Night's Watch, and the occasional caravans seeking lost treasure trudged around its broken edges. Some sections were still upright, sheer cliff faces of layered ice, but significant stretches had collapsed. Gaps now allowed travelers to pass without fear, and rumor held that the wild winds gusted through those breaches like the call of a dead kingdom. He remembered the last time he had gazed upon the wall, standing sturdy as ever, while he was still a steward to Jor Mormont. He had looked upon its vastness, that silent frozen sentinel that stretched from the Bay of Seals on the eastern coast all the way to the far west. The memory now brought forth a heaviness in his heart. Such a fixture of his life, so seemingly eternal, had been proven fragile. So much had happened, so much had changed. He took a breath and reminded himself of the presence behind him. Ghost padded soundlessly through the drifts, a hint of pink in his ears from the cold. The direwolf had grown even larger since their earliest journeys together. Standing at Jon's side, Ghost's gaze was fixed north, ears pricked, sharing in his master's silent contemplation of that region, of the bond they had, shaped by that unyielding cold. A single caw caught Jon's attention. A raven wheeled overhead, its wings a smudge of midnight over the faint purple sky. He wondered if this was some leftover bird of the Night's Watch, if it still remembered the messages it once carried, the battles it once bore witness to. The raven's harsh croak mingled with the hush of the landscape, and then it flew off to the west, perhaps searching for carrion or companionship among the lonely places. Jon took one last, slow look around before descending the hill. He needed to keep moving. The idea had taken shape in his mind so gradually that at first he did not recognize it as a plan. But now it was fully formed. If the wall was to be rebuilt, if it was to stand again as a bulwark against all that might come from the far north, then the only power capable of aiding such a monumental task might be Dragonfire. He did not know how, exactly, the ice and fire would interact. He was no maester, nor did he have an intimate knowledge of arcane mysteries. But he believed in the might of dragons, and if he could find Drogon, perhaps he could bring forth a new dawn for the wall. When he reached the bottom of the hill, he found his horse tied to a skeletal birch. The beast stamped and tossed its head, slightly spooked. Ghost approached, nose twitching, and the horse settled when it recognized the direwolf's presence. Jon patted its flank. "Easy," he murmured. He understood the journey ahead might unnerve any living creature. The path would take them into areas haunted by White Walker legends, half-forgotten nightmares, and the memory of war. He mounted the horse, feeling the tension in its muscles. Ghost trotted beside them, his red eyes watchful for any sign of threat. The morning air was heavy with the promise of more snow, despite the season's official turn toward spring. The path he followed was barely a path at all, more a series of wheel ruts, half-frozen mud, and lumps of snow that had once been carefully cleared by travelers. He guided his horse slowly, letting the animal pick a footing through the icy mess. Every so often, he spotted the remains of a small campsite, blackened embers rimed with frost. Each was deserted and silent. At midday, he paused to let the horse rest and to share a bit of salt pork. The day had brightened a touch, but there was still no real warmth in the sun. It emerged from behind woolly gray clouds, then retreated again, leaving the world in a dim half-light. The emptiness of the land weighed on Jon. He had seen war-scarred places before, but this was different. It was the silence of a world unsure of its future. So much had been shaken, so many certainties undone. He allowed himself to reflect on the shape of his hopes. He had not told anyone about his plan. He was not sure who would understand, or who would even believe. Tyrion, maybe, but he had parted ways with the imp after the trial, with no certainty they would meet again. Even if Jon had confided in him, it might have made no difference. Tyrion was not in a position to command or shape such grand endeavors. As for the new king on the Iron Throne, well, perhaps Bran might have understood. But there was something inside Jon that resisted confiding in his brother, who was king now, or rather, a figure half lost to visions and mysteries. Jon's destiny felt singular, a call only he could answer. He finished his sparse meal and nudged the horse back into motion. The hours dragged quietly on, and as dusk approached, he saw shapes moving far off in the fields. They were distant enough that he could not immediately recognize them, but he guessed they might be wild animals, bears, wolves, or maybe just travelers. He remained wary, resting a hand on his sword. His breath hung in the air like a phantom, and he pressed on, reluctant to light a torch too early for fear of drawing attention. By the time he made camp that evening, the sky had turned a deep cobalt, spangled with pale stars. A wind snatched at the edges of his cloak, and he could almost imagine the howls of ghosts in the gusts. "Ghost," he said softly, turning to see the direwolf prowling the perimeter. "Stay close." The wolf's red eyes glowed in the reflection of the small fire Jon built. Satisfied the horse was hobbled and as comfortable as it could be, he stretched his bedroll on the ground. The cold pressed in from every side, numbing his fingers despite the fire. Yet, he found himself strangely at peace. A quiet sense of purpose warmed him more than the meager flames ever could. He could picture Drogon in his mind, broad wings beating the air, black scales glistening like oil, eyes ablaze with a terrible intelligence. If the rumors were true, Drogon had sometimes flown north, over the lakes and forests, sometimes disappeared beyond the horizon as though searching for something, perhaps even Daenerys' final resting place. Jon did not know if dragons felt grief in the way humans did, but he was certain the beast bore the memory of its mother. If Drogon recognized him, Jon Snow, as the man who had loved Daenerys and then betrayed her, would the dragon set him aflame? Jon had wrestled with that question for nights. It gnawed at him, a fear lurking beneath the surface of his determination. It would be an easy end, to be swallowed by dragonfire. But he had to try. This was not about seeking forgiveness from a beast. This was about rebuilding something that had protected the realms of men for centuries. He owed it to the memory of all who had fought and died in the north, to restore that final shield, or at least to attempt it. Night's hush wrapped the world, and Jon dozed, though he was no stranger to keeping one ear open. Any snap of a twig or whisper of movement stirred him. Ghosts prowled further afield. Once or twice the direwolf's silhouette passed between Jon and the firelight, blotting out the glow and reminding him that there were other shapes in the dark. Shapes that might also watch him from the deep gloom. Eventually a heavier slumber overtook him, and he dreamt of dragons roaring beneath the starry sky, ice cracking, and a sense of overwhelming heat. He rose at dawn, stiff and cold, and extinguished his fire. Another day of travel stretched before him, and each day's ride would bring him closer to the broken ramparts. He was not sure how many days it would take, for the roads were uncertain. Maps were not a guarantee. The old watchtowers and castles that had once lined the route to the wall might well be abandoned or destroyed. He only knew the general direction, the lonely magnetism that pulled him toward the place where he had spent so many years of his life. Midday found him passing by an abandoned farm. The fence had collapsed, and snowdrifts piled against the walls of the low stone cottage. He guided his horse closer. Ghost wandered ahead, poking his muzzle into the open doorway. John dismounted. A swirl of old leaves and straw blew from inside. The interior smelled of rotted wood and the faint tang of old decay. Perhaps an animal had died within during the winter, though there were no bones or fur to be seen now. He spent a few minutes inside, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The roof was half intact, half fallen. He saw a broken wooden table, a rusted lantern, a scattering of clay shards that might once have been a pitcher. No sign of the former occupants. They might have fled south during the wars, or succumbed to raids, or simply perished in the cold. He considered using the cottage for shelter that night, but decided it was too early in the day to stop. Instead, he found a few scraps of charcoal in the hearth and tucked them away, a meager supply that might prove helpful in the nights to come. Outside, the wind was picking up. He covered his mouth with a scarf to keep from inhaling the stinging cold and urged the horse onward. The birch trees glimmered around him, branches swaying. The sky was layered with fast-moving clouds. He guessed a storm was coming, or at least a blast of unsettled weather. Sighing, he pressed forward. Snowflakes danced on that wind, swirling in gentle eddies at first, then building intensity. The horse snorted in annoyance, and Ghost shook his head. John tugged on the reins, forcing himself to remain calm. He had traveled through worse storms. With vigilance and patience, he pressed ahead. But after another hour, it became clear the snowfall was thickening, the air turning into a white haze. The trail was vanishing beneath fresh drifts, and the shapes of trees grew ghostly, as if cut from half-forgotten memories. A part of him was tempted to turn back to that cottage he had found. But the thought of losing a day or two weighed on him. The clock in his mind ticked with a relentless sense of responsibility. He told himself that finding Drogon, if indeed the dragon roamed these skies, would require courage. And so instead of turning back, he looked for any sign of a cave or stand of thick pines that might provide shelter. The snow became so dense, it was almost a blizzard, swirling in a howling fury. Eventually, he spotted a small copse of evergreens on a slight rise. They formed a dense stand of dark, needled branches. John guided the horse beneath those boughs, where the snow was partially screened. He dismounted and used his gloved hands to clear a small area beneath the thickest tree, piling snow around the edges to create a rudimentary wall. Ghost circled, ears flattened against the wind. John coaxed the horse deeper among the trunks, tying the reins to a low branch and taking care to ensure the animal could move enough to stay warm. Then he knelt and began to build a small fire. The wind snatched at his tinder, but his perseverance eventually rewarded him with a flickering flame. Though it was meager, it banished some of the chill from his bones. He sat with his back against the trunk, legs drawn to his chest, watching the snow swirl beyond their little patch of relative calm. Ghost settled beside him, thick fur dusted with white, watching the wind with alert eyes. There was a strange solace in the moment, alone with the storm and his own thoughts. It was almost too easy to forget that a short while ago, the fate of kingdoms had been at stake, that dragons soared above battlefields, that the Night King had marched on Winterfell. Now, there was only the hush of the storm, and the memory of that grand conflict hung like a faint echo in the back of Joan's mind. He tilted his head skyward, glimpsing a patch of dusk sky through the tangle of boughs. Might Drogon be up there somewhere, gliding above the clouds? If so, the dragon was no doubt unconcerned by a mere snowstorm. John closed his eyes and listened to the relentless wind. He felt the old pang of longing. It reminded him of the moments he'd had with Daenerys, moments that now felt like a dream or a story from another life. He wondered if Drogon's presence was also a ghost of her memory, drifting north, searching for a place to rest. When the snow finally began to lessen, the day was almost gone. Twilight bathed the forest in a strange leaden glow. John remained where he was, deciding to make camp properly, rather than risk riding out again. He curled under his cloak. The cold was savage, and from time to time he rose to feed the small fire with broken branches, pacing around the trees to keep his blood moving. Ghost would sometimes vanish into the gloom to sniff at the surroundings, but he always returned, silent as the falling snow. In the deep of night, John could not sleep. He lay awake, half in a doze, thinking. The hush was complete, aside from the sigh of the wind. Then, a roar split the night. It tore across the sky, seeming to come from all directions at once, and Joan's heart leapt into his throat. He jolted upright, fumbling for Longclaw. Ghost also sprang to attention, the direwolf's ears sharp, hackles rising. The roar died out, replaced by a faint rumble like distant thunder. For a moment, John wondered if it had truly been real, or if he had dreamt it. But Ghost's reaction confirmed it was no dream. He rose carefully and took a few steps beyond the shelter of the evergreens. The night was almost black, the moon buried behind cloud. But he searched the sky anyway, straining his eyes for a silhouette, for any sign of something massive and winged. At first he saw nothing, only swirling snow and the vague outlines of trees. Then he caught a hint of movement, something large and dark passing across a clearing in the clouds, a shape so vast his mind could hardly register it. A second roar echoed, rolling across the world like a herald's trumpet. John's stomach tightened. There was no mistaking that call. That was the sound of a dragon, Drogon. There was a certain heartbreak in the sound, at least as John imagined it. It was not the triumphant roar he remembered from the battles. It had a plaintive undertone, as though the dragon were calling out to someone who would never answer. John did not move from his spot, worried that if he left the shelter, he might lose the beast in the swirling darkness. So he listened as the roar trailed off. He wondered if Drogon's path would bring the creature close, or if it was merely passing overhead. Minutes dragged into endless spans of time as he stared upward, every muscle taut with expectation. At length, there was nothing but the distant moan of the wind. If Drogon still prowled above, he kept silent. John returned to his meager fire, uncertain whether to curse his luck or thank the gods for allowing him to hear the dragon's presence. On the one hand, it was a reminder that Drogon was indeed out here, capable of unleashing unimaginable fire. On the other, it underscored how small John was, how all his plans hinged on convincing a creature that might despise him or pay him no heed. Still, it kindled a fierce resolve in his chest. He whispered into the dark, "I'm coming, you know. I will find you." When morning arrived, bleak and pale, he wasted no time packing his things. The storm had mostly subsided, leaving a rolling field of fresh drifts that glimmered in the early light. His horse pawed nervously at the snow, but John calmed it with soft words. He felt more certain of his heading now. Drogon's roar had come from the northwest, and though sound could be deceptive in such weather, he would keep that direction in mind. He rode on, pressing further, letting the horse's hooves crunch through the crust of ice. At times, he encountered old wooden signs that once marked the approach to certain castles of the Night's Watch. They were mostly broken or too weathered to read. A lonely watchtower appeared in the distance, its top collapsed. John rode closer out of curiosity, hoping to find some sign of watchmen or wildlings. But it was abandoned. The door was half off its hinges, and broken arrows littered the threshold. An old skirmish, the details of which were lost to time. He made a quick check of the interior, finding nothing but scattered debris. Ascending the narrow stone steps, he emerged onto the collapsed roof. From this slightly higher vantage, he scanned the horizon. Mostly, the view was of endless white fields and the dark smudge of forests. He thought he saw a flicker of movement on a far hill, but it could have been just the stirring of shadows in the wind. Still, he clung to the hope that Drogon might be hunting or circling somewhere near. By afternoon, John noticed the air carried a peculiar tang, as though it were sharper, colder. He recognized a faint whiff of salt, which told him the sea was not too far east. That meant he was nearing the region where Eastwatch by the Sea had once stood. Perhaps a day or so north of that was the Shattered Wall. The knowledge sent a tingle through him. He felt the old pull of duty, of belonging, even though the Night's Watch was not what it once was. The vow might still live in his heart, but the institution had changed shape. He guided the horse to a slow walk, letting it rest as the day wore on. He had heard rumors that at Eastwatch's remains, a few fishermen still eked out a living, though the harbor had fallen into disrepair. The castle itself had collapsed when the Night King's dragon attacked, leaving no real fortress behind. But maybe there would be signs of life. Perhaps someone there might have seen Drogon pass overhead. The next dawn broke with a sliver of sunlight that actually held some warmth, as if it were an omen that his journey was reaching a turning point. He was cold and stiff from another night on the ground, but he took heart in that pale sunlight. Leading the horse, he made good time, crossing a wide stretch of open terrain. The ground sloped gently upward, and after a few hours, he came upon a crest from which he could see miles of land. It was there, in the distance. The remains of the wall. Even from afar, it was unmistakable. Where once a massive white barrier of ice had cut across the landscape, there was now a jagged ruin. Great shards of icy rubble stood like broken teeth. The early sun picked out glints on the ice's surface, turning them briefly to silver. The emptiness beyond, the expanse of the north, gaped like an open mouth. A shiver ran down Jean's spine. So many memories. So many ghosts of battles fought and nearly lost. He dismounted, letting the horse nibble at a tuft of withered grass. Ghost joined him at the edge of that rise, tail low but ears forward. John rested a hand on the direwolf's flank. "This is it, Ghost," he murmured. "But we have far to go yet." They continued down the slope toward the remains of the castle that had once watched the eastern coastline. As he neared Eastwatch's ruins, he saw fewer trees, replaced by rocky ground and patches of gravel. The sea wind found him again, colder than he remembered, whipping strands of his hair across his face. Ahead, a scattering of small huts dotted the shoreline near where the harbor must have been. Thin trails of smoke rose from a couple of them, hinting that they were inhabited. He approached cautiously, unsure how these folk might greet him. They could be wildlings, or exiles, or ordinary fisherfolk, just struggling to survive. When they spotted him, a few men emerged. One was tall and gaunt, wrapped in a patched cloak that seemed made of old burlap. Another was broader, his face scarred, wearing bits of mismatched fur. They did not raise weapons, but they eyed him warily, shifting on their feet. John halted a short distance away, keeping his hands visible. Ghost lingered near him, hackles slightly raised. The men regarded the direwolf with uneasy curiosity. John cleared his throat. "I mean no harm," he called. "I'm traveling north, hoping to find a place to stay for the night, and some news." One man grunted, stepping forward. "Not many come this way, stranger. North is all broken land, ruin, and cold. What business do you have there?" His accent was rough, somewhere between a northern burr and the free folk's cadence. John considered how much to reveal. "I was once part of the Night's Watch," he said, taking a small gamble. "Came this way to see what's left. Maybe see if there's any chance of rebuilding. Folks say you see all sorts of things up here." The men exchanged glances. One of them spat on the ground. "Night's Watch, eh? Not much left to watch." He nodded at John's armor, noting the worn black tunic. "But if you be no foe, you can keep a fire with us tonight. We've little to share, but you're welcome to the fish we caught." John inclined his head. "Thank you." Cautiously, he led his horse toward the huts. He made sure Ghost walked close, not wanting the direwolf to spook anyone. A couple of children peered out from behind a battered door, wide-eyed. The smell of fish, wood smoke, and the brine of the sea mingled in the chilly air. The huts were ramshackle at best, as if the storms had battered them repeatedly, but the small community seemed to endure. They led John to a pitiful fire near a lean-to. He handed over a few coins, though he was not sure the currency was worth anything to them. They took it politely, and one man, introducing himself as Ralt, tossed a couple more branches onto the fire. "We don't see many visitors. A few wildlings come through. Some men from further south searching for lost relics or some such. They don't stay long." "Done. Have you seen a dragon?" John asked, deciding to be direct. A large black beast in the sky. At once, the men stiffened. One crossed himself. Another spat again. Ralph's face was grave. "We have," he said softly, glancing at the others. "A couple times, we heard its cries. Saw its shadow pass over the land. One time, it came down the coastline, its shape so large it blocked the sun. We hid in the huts, praying it would not see us. The beast roared, shook the air, but it continued on, heading north. Another time we found a burnt carcass of a whale on the beach, half eaten. Must have been the dragon's work. Banana bender. John nodded, heart quickening. When was the last time? Ralt scratched at his patchy beard. Near a fortnight ago, give or take. We saw it flying from the east out over the water. Seemed to wander inland after that. John felt relief and tension mingling. Drogon was indeed here in these skies. You've no sign of it since? None. John sighed and stared at the flames. He could almost picture Drogon's enormous wings spread over the sea, the froth of waves far below. Has there been any trouble with it? Attacks? The broader man, who still had not offered a name, shook his head. Not on us. We keep our fires small and stay inside when we hear it. Might be it hunts seals, whales, maybe bears further north. Whatever it wants, it don't seem to care about us. We're too small. John gazed at the meager settlement. It made sense. Drogon wouldn't waste his time on a handful of fishers. I appreciate the information, he said softly. They sat around the fire for a while. John learned there were 8 families here, scraping by, too poor or too untrusting to seek a new life in the south. Their huts offered some protection from the harsh winds, and occasionally, passing traders left them supplies. But mostly, they lived day by day, pulling what fish they could from the icy waters. John respected their resilience. They asked him little else about his purpose, and he offered no more detail than that he was once a crow, traveling to see the remains of his old post. That night, he spread his bedroll near the dying fire. Ghost curled beside him, head resting on paws, watchful. Outside, the sea murmured against the shore, and the wind rattled the huts. The men had warned him about the tide surging unpredictably at times, especially after storms. But it seemed calm tonight. He could not sleep deeply. His mind whirred with possibilities of how to find Drogon, how to convince the beast to come with him to the wall. He pictured the crumbling towers of Castle Black, the wind-swept courtyard where new recruits once practiced. He remembered the looming ramparts of ice. If he could bring Drogon there, maybe the dragon's fire could fuse or shape the ice, forging new fortifications. But that was all speculation. A dream. First, he had to find Drogon. Then, he had to survive the encounter. In the early hours, John rose quietly, not wanting to wake the others. He left a small token of thanks, a silver piece, by the ashes of the fire, though it might not do them much good. Stepping outside, he pulled his cloak tighter. The hush of pre-dawn wrapped the settlement. Ghost padded at his side. The horse waited near a fence of driftwood. John whispered a greeting to the animal, petting its muzzle. He turned, looking north. The broken line of the wall glinted in the distance, pale in the watery light. The gulls cried overhead, swirling in the sky. He mounted his horse, and without a backward glance, he continued north, skirting the coast for a while, letting the steed pick its way across pebbled ground and patches of brittle grass. The morning passed in a patient rhythm. The crunch of hooves, the whisper of the sea breeze, the occasional cry of seabirds. When midday came, he cut inland, heading directly toward the largest gap in the wall. In the final days of the Great War, that section had been assaulted by Viserion's undead flame, and it had collapsed in a thunderous avalanche of ice. It was said to be the most passable route for travelers now. He guessed if Drogon roamed in search of lost or forgotten corners of the world, the beast might wander around that breach. As he rode, he caught glimpses of the gargantuan ruin, a labyrinth of broken ice and twisted lumps that towered taller than any castle's walls. Memories flooded him. The times he and his brothers in the Watch had scaled those icy heights, breath steaming, hearts pounding. The nights he stood on top of the wall, peering into the darkness beyond. The moment he chose to let the free folk pass, believing in a higher purpose. The battles that followed. It all felt so far away, yet here he was again, drawn back by an unbroken sense of duty. Hour by hour, he drew closer. The scale of the collapsed ice became more apparent. Giant slabs lay strewn across the ground, some half-melted, revealing layers of sediment and ancient rock trapped within. Pools of water glimmered where the ice had thawed under the sun. only to refreeze in the frigid nights. The land was pitted with hollows and ridges, forming a terrain that seemed alien and forbidding. Finally, he reached the edge of what had once been the shadow of the wall itself. Standing at the foot of those shards of ice, he felt like an ant at the edge of a vast glacier. The wind moaned across the surface, swirling snow into eddies. He dismounted, letting the horse rest. Ghost sniffed at a mound of fallen ice. Jon placed a gloved hand on the nearest chunk and felt a chill that seemed to seep into his bones. It was a sobering sight, this once impenetrable barrier fallen into ruin. He ventured further among the wreckage, leading the horse. The air felt unnaturally still, though the wind whistled at times. The lumps of ice glistened with an eerie inner light, capturing the faint sun's rays. He found a relatively open area, a sort of valley carved between ice boulders, and paused. Closing his eyes, he listened. Nothing but the quiet pulse of the wind. He had half a mind to call out, though he knew that was foolish. Drogon would not come just because Jon shouted his name. But an idea began to form in his mind. If Drogon was near, might the dragon respond to fire, the way it had once answered Daenerys' signals? It was far from certain, but it was the only guess he had. He began to gather bits of wood and brush from the sparse vegetation that clung to the edges of the ice. Most of it was damp, but he persisted. He built a small pile, using the charcoal he had salvaged to help coax a flame. It took time, but eventually, a thin plume of smoke curled upward. Then a flicker of orange flame danced, bright in the pale gloom. He fed the fire carefully, stirring it until it crackled with modest vigor. Once it was going, he stood back, letting the smoke rise into the sky. He was aware this signal might just draw any nearby wildlings or bandits, or maybe nothing at all. But if Drogon hunted this region, perhaps the dragon would investigate the scent of fire. Ghost sat at his side, ears pricked. The horse, uneasy at the closeness of the flames, stamped and snorted. Jon murmured a calming word, patting its flank. The hours dragged. He fed the fire slowly, stirring it until it produced more smoke. He paced around the makeshift campsite, scanning the skies. Clouds drifted lazily across the sun. Once or twice, the shape of a bird caused him to tense, only for him to realize it was no more than an eagle or hawk. The day wore on, and the sun began its downward arc. The wind shifted, blowing the smoke away to the northeast. Jon considered giving up for the day. He had planned to scout further, find a more sheltered place to camp, but a dogged stubbornness made him wait just a little longer. He felt something in the pit of his stomach, a tension that told him he wasn't alone. He stoked the fire again, sending up a fresh plume of smoke. Then he heard it, a distant rush of air, a sound like sails caught in a stiff breeze, but deeper, more powerful. He froze, eyes fixed on the horizon. The sky was tinted with the golds and purples of late afternoon. His heart hammered in his chest. Ghost leapt to his feet, hackles rising. The horse nickered nervously. Jon turned slowly, scanning the clouds. Then he saw it, a large black shape emerging from behind a ragged cloud bank. It glided with unmistakable grace, wings spanning an impossible width, tail trailing behind like a serpent. Even from afar, the presence was thunderous. Drogon, Doughty. Jon's breath caught in his throat. The dragon soared in a lazy arc, perhaps having caught sight or scent of the smoke. Jon could see the sunlight glinting off its ebony scales, see the monstrous outline of its head. A swirl of conflicting emotions roiled in his gut. Awe, fear, sorrow. He raised a trembling hand, as if that gesture would bring the beast closer. Drogon let out a low rumble that echoed across the broken ice. The dragon circled once, then began to descend, not too close but near enough that Jon felt the air shift under the beast's wing beats. Ghost growled softly, but Jon stepped forward, whispering reassurance. The wind from those mighty wings pummeled him as Drogon alighted on a massive slab of ice. The impact shook the ground. The dragon's talons gripped the slick surface, steam rising from where its body heat met the cold. Jon's voice caught in his throat. He forced himself to steady his breathing. He wanted to speak, but the words felt flimsy against this colossal presence. Drogon fixed him with an enormous eye. pupils contracting to black slits. The dragon's nostrils flared, and a gust of hot breath escaped, warming the air with the sharp scent of sulfur. Jon took one step closer, mindful of the lethal speed with which Drogon could lash out. The memory of that final day with Daenerys flared in his mind, of Drogon's grief-laden roar. He swallowed. "Drogon," he said softly, voice trembling. I'm here." The dragon shifted, tail lashing across the ice, sending shards skittering. The horse whinnied in terror, trying to pull away from the tether. Ghost stood rigid, red eyes locked on the gigantic creature. For a moment, Jon glimpsed something in Drogon's gaze, an echo of the bond once shared with Daenerys. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, but it was overshadowed by tension, the primal wariness of a beast that recognized danger. Drogon let out a growl, deep and resonant, that shook the air around them. Jon lifted both hands, palms out. "I'm sorry," he whispered. He did not know if he was apologizing for Daenerys, for what he had done, or for daring to face the dragon now. Maybe it was for all of it. His voice trembled with the weight of sorrow. "I'm so sorry." Drogon's chest swelled. Jon recognized the telltale sign that the dragon was preparing to breathe fire. The black scales along its throat rippled, heat shimmering around its jaws. In that heartbeat, Jon wondered if his life was about to end, incinerated in a blaze of unstoppable flame. Still, he did not move. He kept his hands raised. He was prepared. He owed Daenerys at least that much. A roar tore from Drogon's throat. Flames ignited, spewing forth in a torrent of orange-red fury. The heat slammed into the ice, sending a cloud of steam billowing upward. Jon felt the scorching air wash over him, and he flung himself aside, landing hard against the frozen ground. Ghost barked, leaping clear of the sudden surge of fire. The horse screamed, thrashing in panic, but the tether held. Steam enshrouded the world, swirling around in a searing cloud. Jon coughed, eyes stinging, the heat and wetness clinging to his skin. He scrambled to his feet, expecting at any moment another blast. He could not see Drogon through the steam, only shadows. A deep hiss rumbled, disorienting him. Then the swirl parted, revealing Drogon's silhouette. The dragon had pivoted, claws scraping, leaving a molten path in the ice where the flames had struck. Jon struggled to find his voice, to do anything that might calm the beast, but terror and awe held him speechless. Drogon's tail swept the ground, and the creature's chest heaved with another furious breath. Yet, Drogon did not unleash another torrent of fire. Instead, he snarled in frustration, as if conflicted by what to do next. Jon steadied himself, forcing his gaze to meet the dragon's burning eyes through the veil of steam. He thought he saw a flicker of recognition again, a painful memory behind those reptilian pupils. Cautiously, he inched forward, ignoring the pounding of his heart. "I'm here to help," he breathed. I want to rebuild, Drogon. The wall. For her. For them. For everyone. I need your fire." He had no idea if the dragon could grasp his words, but perhaps it could sense the sincerity in his posture, in his voice that cracked with sorrow. Drogon snorted, releasing a puff of dark smoke. The steam drifted away, revealing the scars from that final battle etched across the dragon's scales, jagged marks on wings, a pockmark along its flank. The quiet that followed was more menacing than any roar. Jon stood, hands trembling, mind racing. He did not dare advance too close. He saw droplets of water dripping from the edges of the ice, heated by the dragon's presence. He saw the trembling flanks of his terrified horse. He saw Ghost, fur on end, standing a few yards away, ready to defend his master if it came to that. Seconds stretched into eons. Drogon and Jon regarded each other, predator and supplicant. Finally, as if by some unspoken agreement, Drogon shifted his weight. The dragon emitted a rumbling exhalation and lifted its head, a regal gesture that seemed to say, "Speak or run, or do what you will, my fire is yours to risk." Jon swallowed. Carefully, he took another step forward, the crunch of his boots on the ice echoing in the hush. He reached the blackened patch of ground where Drogon's fire had struck. Steam rose around his ankles. He had no plan for how to fully earn the dragon's trust, no illusions that he could bend Drogon to his will. All he had was his resolve, a battered heart, and a promise to do right by the realms of men. That would have to suffice for now. He took a breath, slow and purposeful, and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "We rebuild the wall." Drogon's golden eyes narrowed. A single rumble passed through the dragon's chest, reverberating through the icy ruin like distant thunder. The setting sun washed the crumpled ice in orange and pink hues, lending a strange fiery glow to the shattered land. Jon stared into those ancient, grief-stricken eyes, feeling the weight of his own remorse. Some things could never be undone, but some things could be rebuilt. In that moment, beneath the watchful gaze of the last living dragon of the Targaryen line, Jon Snow made his choice, as inevitable as the turning of seasons. He would do whatever it took to rebuild the wall, to safeguard the North, to honor those who had fallen, and perhaps in the doing, find a measure of atonement for the blood he had spilled. Ghost let out a low, whining howl that echoed through the broken ice. Drogon raised his head toward the darkening sky, and with a roar that shook the shattered remains of Eastwatch, he breathed a plume of flame so fierce and bright, it stained the clouds a vivid, violent red. Jon stood there, watching as the inferno illuminated the twilight. He felt the rush of heat on his face, felt the ice at his feet melt away. He did not flinch. In that crackling blaze, he saw both a warning and a promise. The path ahead was unclear, dangerous, possibly impossible. But if there was any creature alive that could reshape these ruins, any creature that could stand as a bulwark against winter's vengeance, it was the dragon who roared into the dying light. And if there was any man stubborn enough to try, it was the one who had already died once, who had faced kings and undead armies, who carried in his veins the blood of ice and fire. As Drogon's roar faded into the vast northern silence, Jon felt a surge of purpose swell in his chest. The sun slipped below the horizon, and dusk settled over the broken land. He placed a hand over his heart, breath trembling in the cold air, and lifted his gaze to meet Drogon's once more. "We begin," he whispered to the beast, to the memory of Daenerys, to the swirling shadows of ghosts that haunted his mind. "And we do not turn back." Ikea. Jon lingered in the aftermath of Drogon's blaze, the acrid scent of scorched air filling his lungs. The ice had begun to melt in shallow channels around the dragon's landing place, creating glossy rivulets that carved patterns through the shattered remnants of Eastwatch's ramparts. Fat droplets trickled down the sheer faces of broken ice, and the wet sheen reflected the dragon's towering silhouette in shifting pools of pale light. A final gust of heat radiated from Drogon's nostrils, then dissipated into the encroaching night. The horse, wild-eyed and trembling, strained at its tether, foam flecking its mouth. Jon moved carefully, half expecting another roar of fire from Drogon. But the beast remained still, perched atop the crushed ice like a fierce idol. Only the slow rise and fall of the dragon's sides betrayed that it lived, breathed, and seethed with thoughts of its own. Ghost let out a low whine, edging closer to Jon, as if uncertain whether to guard his master or keep distance from the monstrous creature. Jon forced himself to breathe normally. He rested a palm on Ghost's thick fur, reassuring them both. "I won't turn back," he repeated, an echo of that quiet oath, and his voice sounded small in the immense hush that now settled over the broken land. The sun had vanished below the horizon, leaving a narrow band of orange behind the darkening sky. Stars began to prick the firmament, faint and cold. In that twilight gloom, Drogon's black scales merged seamlessly with the shadows, except when the creature's eyes caught the last glimmers of light and gleamed as if lit from within. Jon felt the weight of that gaze, a living furnace in the shape of a dragon, assessing him. He understood that forcing an encounter now, pressing too hard, would be a mistake. Even with his heritage, Targaryen blood, if it truly meant anything in the eyes of a dragon, he could not expect immediate compliance. So he stood there, rooted in the half-melted ground, the chill creeping up his legs, every nerve on edge as if awaiting judgment. When Drogon eventually turned its head and gazed out across the blasted plain, Jon released a long breath. Perhaps that was all the acknowledgement he would receive for the moment. Slowly, he moved to untether the horse. The poor creature shivered with fear, but it allowed him to run a calming hand along its flank. He knew he had to find some place to shelter for the night, some hollow or half-standing ruin that could offer a barrier against the northern wind. Yet the presence of the dragon overshadowed all such practicalities. He felt an urge to remain, to show Drogon he would not flee or cower. Even so, there was no sense in standing about in the open, half-frozen and unprotected. He glanced over his shoulder. The labyrinth of ice beyond them might contain some small cave or depression. Certainly, the meltdown and shifting over the past years would have hollowed out pockets. Perhaps one of the old Night's Watch outbuildings or storehouses still stood, an alcove among the rubble. Reluctantly, Jon gave a short whistle for Ghost to follow, and began leading the horse forward. Drogon shifted, the scrape of massive talons echoing across the ice. Jon paused, uncertain if the dragon was about to launch into the air or pounce. Instead, Drogon took several deliberate steps, flattening a hillock of broken shards, and angled its head in his direction. The posture might have been curiosity or challenge. It was impossible to say. Jon looked into those molten eyes. "You can follow," he said softly, feeling foolish talking to a beast that might not understand human words. "Or stay, but I'll be here in the morning." Drogon gave no obvious response, only another low rumble deep in its chest. Then the dragon drew back its lips, revealing razor teeth, and let out a breath that sent a cascade of steam into the air. The display was unsettling, but Jon held his ground. Finally, Drogon sank onto the ice, resting on its belly like a cat preparing for a night watch. The beast's tail coiled around the slab, sharp spines glinting. It struck Jon almost like an invitation or a truce, though that might have been wishful thinking. He forced himself to turn away and continue his slow trek among the rubble, leading the nervous horse behind him. Ghost padded close, nose low to the ground. Sharp ridges of ice formed walls on either side of them, glimmering with moonlight. Freezing water sloshed around Jon's boots. He could hear the faint drip of meltwater in the hush, like the ticks of an otherworldly clock. Occasionally, the ice groaned, shifting under its own weight. The sound echoed off the surrounding shards, and each time Jon tightened his grip on the reins, imagining a collapse that would bury them alive. He found a spot where a hunk of the wall had cracked and toppled, forming an overhang. The space beneath was cramped, just enough room for him, the horse, and Ghost if they pressed close. Water had pooled in the corner, shining under the thin slice of moon. He guided the horse inside, rubbing its flank to calm it. Then he set about gathering shards of driftwood, old pieces of crates, anything that might burn for a short while. He scrounged among the debris, mindful that if Drogon was nearby, any flash of fire might attract the beast's attention again. Still, the cold demanded a small flame. He stacked the scraps in a makeshift pit near the overhang's entrance, well away from the horse. Ghost sniffed the air, alert for any sign of the dragon's presence. But so far, the night was still. Jon lit the pile, coaxing a feeble flame to life. Smoke curled toward the low ceiling, collecting in a hazy cloud. He coughed and waved a hand, but soon the worst of it drifted out into the open. The pale glow of the newborn fire illuminated the icy walls, revealing swirling inclusions trapped within. It reminded Jon of the precious dragon glass he had once mined from beneath Dragonstow's fortress, hidden behind layers of black rock. There were secrets here too, locked away in the frozen heart of the north. Sitting with his back to a chunk of fallen ice, Jon cradled his gloved hands around the fire's warmth. Ghost settled at his feet, massive paws splayed on the wet ground. The horse, still uneasy, stood tethered near the far wall, occasionally stamping or flicking its tail. Jon reached into his pack and pulled out a small ration of dried meat, chewing it slowly. The tension in his shoulders refused to ease. He half expected to see Drogon's silhouette appear at the overhang looming in the red firelight. Yet the darkness remained empty. In the hush, his thoughts turned inward. He wondered what path Drogon had taken since flying away from King's Landing that fateful day, carrying Daenerys' lifeless body in its claws, wounded by grief and rage. Could the dragon truly sense who he was, what he had done? Dragons were said to be intelligent, but also mercurial. Jon had no illusions that his Targaryen blood would grant him complete immunity. Yet, he felt an undercurrent of, not acceptance exactly, but a reluctant equilibrium in that short confrontation. Drogon had chosen not to kill him. That alone was a fragile starting point. He closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him in the flickering gloom. Daenerys smiling at him in a candlelit tent, the smell of parchment and ink clinging to her as she studied battle plan. Her laughter when she soared over the mountains on Drogon's back, hair streaming behind her. The heartbreak in her eyes when she spoke of the future she wanted to build, before it all went so terribly wrong. He felt the weight of it again, that final betrayal, the taste of tears when he whispered goodbye. Her blood on his hands. The heartbreak in Drogon's roar as it burned the Iron Throne to molten slag. The grief that had nearly consumed them both. The tears that threatened him now he did not bother to wipe away. It was a silent release, passing quickly, leaving only a hollow ache. He breathed, steadying himself, and gazed at the wavering flames. "We rebuild," he murmured to no one, or maybe to her memory. "What else can we do?" Eventually, weariness dragged at him, and he let himself succumb to a fitful sleep. The cramped overhang offered meager comfort. Water dripped from overhead, and the cold seeped through his cloak. Ghost's body heat helped, pressed against his legs. The horse dozed with eyes half-lidded, occasionally twitching. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the ice shards. But Jon did not stir except when a drip landed on his cheek. He dreamed of a vast plain of snow, unending and silent. At its center, the wall towered, whole and pristine, shimmering under a milky sun. Drogon was there, wings folded, standing watch like a living gargoyle. Jon approached, carrying a hammer that glowed with fire. When he raised it, the ice rippled as though alive, singing in a faint chorus of voices. Some that sounded like Sam, others like Edie, some unknown. Then the plain shifted, the snow parted, and he sank down into darkness, hearing the rush of wings all around him. He jolted awake, panting, heart racing. Morning came as a dull wash of pale light that seeped through the cracks in the ice overhead. The embers of the fire had gone cold. Ghost was already awake, standing at the edge of the overhang, nose lifted to the damp air. Jon rose, brushing off bits of frozen dirt and rubbing his stiff neck. He peered out cautiously, half expecting to see Drogon perched nearby. Instead, the plain of broken ice lay empty. The creeping morning fog gave everything a blurred outline. Pools of meltwater glinted like shards of glass. Somewhere in the distance came a slow caw of a raven, lonely and hollow. Jon felt an unexpected pang of disappointment that the dragon was nowhere in sight. He fed and watered the horse as best he could, melting a bit of ice in a tin cup over the last of the coals, then donned his cloak and ventured out. Ghost followed, sniffing at the ground. The surface was slippery, and Jon had to mind his footing. The quiet was profound, a thick hush broken only by the drip of ice and the soft stir of the breeze. As he walked among the wreckage, he surveyed the scale of the task before him. The wall here was not just cracked or chipped. It was utterly shattered in places, entire sections missing or ground into jumbled shards. If he imagined building upon the existing structure, repairing it, he quickly realized the devastation might be too severe to simply piece it back together. But perhaps in other stretches, the wall still stood tall, even if compromised in parts. If he could coax Drogon to use his fire selectively, to melt and fuse, to weld the ice back into some semblance of a barrier. That was the kernel of his plan. Though it sounded mad even to him, he had no other recourse. Conventional methods would take generations of labor, materials that did not exist, and a workforce no longer loyal to any cause but their own survival. He halted in a clearing, hearing a distant scrape that might have been shifting ice, or something else. The hair rose on the back of his neck. He placed a hand on Longclaw's hilt, scanning the dimness. Shadows flickered across a far ridge, but they could have been illusions of fog. Ghost growled softly, ears perked. Jon stepped carefully, heart pounding, expecting a threat to lunge from behind one of the ice boulders. Yet nothing appeared. After a few tense minutes, the sound faded. He wondered if Drogon had circled around, prowling among the twisted remains. With that possibility in mind, Jon took a breath and let it out slowly. "Drogon," he called, voice echoing across the ice. It felt strange to shout that name, as if summoning a storm. The echo reverberated, but no dragon emerged. Frustrated, he turned to retrace his path back toward the overhang. He needed to think of a better way to find or lure Drogon, some method of forging a fragile bond. He reached the makeshift camp. Ghost was sniffing at the ground, occasionally glancing toward the sky. The horse stomped, picking up on Jon's mood. He considered traveling further west, toward the segment of the wall near Castle Black, his old home. Perhaps if he was near the vantage that he and his brothers once patrolled, he might gain a broader view of the land. With that vantage, he could watch for Drogon's flight and maybe direct a signal if the dragon was overhead. The distance was considerable, but not impossible. And in the process he might gather old stores, or discover if any Night's Watch stragglers remained. Decision made, Jon set about preparing for the journey. He fed the horse the last of the oats he had, cursing himself for not bringing more. There was precious little forage in this ruined terrain. The horse would have to rely on what grasses or dried scrub they might find along the way. Scarce pickings, but better than nothing. Ghost needed no such provisioning. The direwolf could hunt, as he had done all his life in the wild. But Jon worried about him wandering too far with a dragon in the area. He thought about the fisherfolk at Eastwatch's remains. Perhaps they had fish to spare, or knowledge of the roads ahead, but doubling back would cost days. Instead, he mounted the horse, scanning the quiet landscape for any sign of a black-winged shape. The sky was empty. Sighing, he nudged the horse into a careful walk, picking a path along the edge of the shattered ice field, where it met the rocky shoreline. Water lapped gently, the tide low. The gloom of morning was beginning to break apart, and a faint patch of blue peeked through the clouds overhead. As he rode, the monotony of the scenery lulled him into half-formed thoughts. Memories surfaced unbidden. Sam standing in the library at Castle Black, cradling an armload of books. Gren, laughing at a stupid joke around the fire. Mormont's voice, stern but proud, commanding the men to stand tall. Ygritte's red hair in the torchlight beneath the wall. Daenerys' eyes shining with ambition and heartbreak. The ghosts of these recollections drifted in and out, leaving Jon filled with a mixture of longing and regret. He paused around midday to rest the horse. Ghost bounded ahead, scouting for anything that moved. The wind off the sea carried a sharper bite now, and the sky overhead had grown restless with thick, dark clouds. It might storm again by nightfall. Jon drank from his waterskin, chewing a strip of dried meat. He reflected on the fact that he had not eaten a hot meal in days, and tried not to let the thought depress him. Survival, for now, was enough. A part of him whispered that this entire quest might be foolhardy. Even if he succeeded in finding Drogon again, forging some understanding, how would he direct the dragon to labor over miles of broken ice? Could a single beast truly reforge an entire wall meant to stand for ages? He shook his head. He had made a vow to keep going, no matter how impossible it seemed. Duty was all he had left, that old refrain beating in his blood like a drum. He mounted again, urging the horse onward. They clopped through a region of rocky outcroppings, each coated in a slippery layer of frozen spray. At times, the horse stumbled, and Jon was forced to dismount and lead it on foot, cautious not to break an ankle. The afternoon waned into a dim twilight. Clouds piled up in the west, turning the sky gunmetal gray. The air felt charged, pregnant with a storm's potential. He contemplated trying to find another nook in the ice, but the terrain here was more stone and less glacier. Eventually, he spotted a cluster of old stone foundations that looked like they might have been storage sheds once upon a time, perhaps used by the Night's Watch to store fishing gear or winter provisions. They stood partially collapsed, battered by the elements. He guided the horse inside the remains of one structure, noticing the walls still offered some windbreak. The roof was long gone, leaving an open space to the sky. Ghost padded around the perimeter, sniffing at mounds of rotted seaweed and driftwood that had washed in during storms. Jon rummaged for anything that might burn. He found a few splintered boards from the collapsed roof. which he broke into smaller pieces. With these, he managed a small fire in a corner where the stone walls converged. Night came swiftly, the dark pressed down by the low-hanging clouds. Lightning flickered on the horizon, revealing the silhouette of the coastline for an instant. The wind rose, howling through the cracks, sending a spray of brine into the air. Every so often, thunder rolled, distant but portentous. Jon huddled near his fire, cloak pulled tight. He dreaded the idea of riding through such a tempest. Far better to wait it out, though it might trap him here for a day or more. The horse, spooked by the flashes of lightning, neighed and backed away from the open sky. Jon stood to soothe it, murmuring quietly and running a calming hand along its flank. The frantic look in the horse's eyes mirrored his own sense of unease. Where was Drogon now, in this stormy darkness? Perhaps soaring above the clouds, wreathed in lightning, or tucked away in some cavern, wings wrapped tight, a slumbering menace. Ghost wandered back, shaking droplets from his fur. Jon noticed the direwolf's ears laid back, as if hearing something beyond the thunder. "What is it?" Jon asked, scanning the gloom. Ghost let out a soft yip, but did not growl or bare his teeth. Likely just the wind's tricks. Still, Jon felt that intangible sense of being watched. He settled down again, letting the horse rest in the driest corner. The fire popped and sputtered in the damp air. Rain began to patter, soft at first, then turning into a steady deluge that rattled against the crumbling stone walls. Water cascaded in, pooling on the uneven floor. Jon cursed under his breath, dragging his belongings away from the rising puddles. But there was little he could do. The storm battered them with relentless sheets of freezing rain. Somewhere in the blackness, thunder rumbled ominously. Hours passed in that half-lit gloom. The fire waned until it was just a pile of steaming embers. Jon tried to doze, huddled under his cloak, leaning against the damp wall. Ghost curled at his side, a warm, solid presence. The horse stood restlessly, occasionally stamping at the water. The storm hammered on unceasing. Rain seeped through every crack, drenching Jon's clothing until he shivered. Sleep was fitful, interrupted by the constant lash of wind and the boom of thunder. At some point in the darkest hours, a new sound erupted. A mighty roar that cut through the storm's din like a battle horn. Jon jolted awake, heart pounding. Ghost leapt to his feet, hackles raised. Lightning flashed, illuminating the world in a sudden stark brilliance, and for an instant, Jon saw a massive shape in the sky, twisting through the clouds. Thunder shook the air almost immediately, rattling the stones. The roar came again, echoing across the sea. Jon scrambled upright, every nerve ablaze with the knowledge that Drogon was out there, braving the storm. He ran to the low wall, straining to see through the sheets of rain. Another flash of lightning revealed the black silhouette again, wings outstretched, battling the gale. It seemed Drogon was in distress, or enraged. Jon could not tell. The dragon's roar was nearly lost beneath the pounding thunder, yet it carried a note of desperation, as if the beast fought to stay aloft. Jon knew he was helpless from here. No method existed to guide Drogon down safely or calm the raging elements. He could only watch, lightning flash by lightning flash, as the dragon wheeled overhead, occasionally vanishing into the boiling clouds. Sheets of silver rain whipped against Jon's face, forcing him to blink rapidly. Ghost stood at his side, also peering upward, eyes reflecting the flicker of lightning. In a spectacular crack of thunder, a bolt of lightning lanced through the clouds, revealing Drogon's entire form for the briefest moment. Wings fully extended, mouth open in a roar against the fury of nature. It was a sight both awe-inspiring and terrifying, as if the old gods were at war with the last living dragon. Jon braced a hand against the wet stone, breath catching. Another roar reverberated, then the storm swallowed the shape again. All through the night, Jon caught glimpses of Drogon's battle with the gale. Sometimes, the dragon's roars sounded distant, as though it had flown miles away. Sometimes, they rattled the foundations, so close Jon's teeth vibrated. The hours blurred together in a storm-tossed nightmare, and each time lightning flashed, Jon found himself praying Drogon would survive. The horse whinnied, half crazed with fear. Ghost paced in anxious circles. Jon stood vigil, soaked to the bone, powerless. At last, near the cusp of dawn, the storm began to abate. The rain lessened to a cold drizzle, and the thunder receded, moving further along the coast. Jon stood at the wall, stiff-limbed, scanning the sky for any sign of the dragon. Dim light crept across the eastern horizon, revealing the destruction left by the storm. The stone walls were slick with water. The ground turned into puddles and slick mud. Seawater churned angrily against the rocks, awash with debris. But there was no sign of Drogon. Jon frowned, stepping out from behind the ruined wall. Rain dripped from his hair, splattered his face. Ghost followed, sniffing the air. The sky was a dull, iron gray, roiling with the aftermath of the tempest. Jon searched the clouds until his eyes ached, waiting for that dark silhouette to reappear. Nothing came. He felt something twist inside him, a pang of worry. Could the dragon have fallen? The roars in the night had been fierce, but also agonized. If Drogon had been struck by lightning, or injured by the raging storm, would Jon find its massive body somewhere along the coastline, dashed by the rocks? The thought churned his stomach with dread. But there was only one way to be sure. Clenching his jaw, he whistled Ghost to him and gathered his sodden belongings. The horse looked miserable, head hanging low, but it was intact. Jon led it out into the drizzle, turning back northward. He would scour the coastline, the rocky inlets, any place large enough to hide a dragon's carcass, or a wounded dragon seeking shelter. Ghost loped ahead, occasionally pausing to sniff at the air. Progress was slow. The terrain was soaked and treacherous, and the horse slipped more than once. Jon felt exhaustion drag at him. His body chilled, and his mind tangled with anxiety. He thought of how, once upon a time, the entire realm might have bent the knee to a dragon rider. Now, here he was, alone on foot, chasing a creature that might or might not want his help. The irony felt almost cruel. Still, he pressed on. The day progressed into a dull afternoon, the drizzle ceasing but leaving an overcast gloom. He saw no sign of the dragon in the sky. The silence was unsettling. Gulls circled overhead, screeching, but that was all. Occasionally, he dismounted to explore jagged cliffs or hollows in the ice, calling Drogon's name into the emptiness. No answer. Rocks tumbled beneath his feet, echoing into watery crevasses. Ghost sniffed brine-stained stones and driftwood, but there was no trace of the dragon's scent that Jon could discern. The hours stretched. Weariness gnawed at him. By late afternoon, he reached a small inlet formed by the partial collapse of the coastline, where a narrow beach of black stones led into choppy water. He paused, letting the horse drink from a freshwater trickle that ran down from the glacier. Ghost wandered off, weaving between tumbled boulders. As Jon knelt to scoop water into his palms, he heard Ghost bark sharply in the distance. He rose at once, scanning the inlet. The direwolf had bounded up a rise of slick, seaweed-covered rocks. Jon hurried after him, mindful of his footing. The wind whipped across the open water, bringing the tang of salt. Ghost barked again, then let out a low whine. Jon reached the top of the rocky rise and looked down into a shallow ravine carved by centuries of tidal flow. There, half submerged in a pool of dark water, lay an enormous shape. At first, Jon's heart clenched, for it seemed motionless. Drogon's flank, black scales stained with mud, wings partly draped over the rocks. One of the massive wings was twisted at an unnatural angle, the membrane torn. The tail extended out into the shallows, battered by small waves. In the gloom, it resembled a beached leviathan. He rushed down, boots slipping on wet stones, while Ghost kept pace, growling softly. As Jon neared, the stench of brine and dragon musk assaulted his senses. The water around Drogon's body was tinted with swirling patterns of blood, dark rivulets that dissipated in the tide. Jon's heart thundered. Was the beast still alive? Slowly, he stepped around to see Drogon's head, resting on a ledge of rock. The eyes were closed, nostrils barely flaring with the faintest breath. Jon exhaled in relief. The dragon was breathing, albeit shallowly. He inched closer, feeling the immensity of those jaws, the lethal curve of teeth. The wing near him was shredded, gashes across the membrane revealing ragged holes. The black scales on Drogon's back were scorched in places, though whether from lightning or friction against the rocks, Jon could not say. Some smaller spines were bent or broken, blood crusting around the base. Drogon's side heaved with a labored breath. A low, pained rumble vibrated the air. Jon felt it in his bones. He knelt, water lapping his boots, arms trembling with the shock of seeing the mighty dragon so vulnerable. Carefully he reached out, placing his hand on a patch of uninjured scales near the beast's neck. The flesh beneath the scales felt feverish, a fierce heat that pulsed with the creature's heartbeat. "I'm here," Jon whispered, unsure if his voice would penetrate Drogon's pain. "I'm here." At that touch, Drogon's eye flickered open. The pupil dilated, focusing on Jon. A growl rattled the dragon's chest, but there was no immediate snap of jaws or torrent of flame. Likely the beast was too weak for that. Still, Jon felt a wave of primal fear. He kept his hand in place, refusing to back away. "Let me help," he said, though how he could help was unclear. He had no healing salves for a dragon, no knowledge of their anatomy beyond what Daenerys had once described. He only had a meager supply of basic medical gear for humans, a few bandages, and a needle and thread. That would be laughably insufficient for a creature of Drogon's size. Drogon rumbled again, flinching as if in pain. The wings gave a spasmodic twitch, sending a splash of water over Jon. Ghost edged closer, nose quivering. The direwolf's posture was cautious but not hostile. Jon swallowed, glancing at the wide tears in the wing membrane. If those were left untreated, infection or exposure might fester. If a bone was broken, it could ground Drogon permanently. Guilt tore at Jon. He had come seeking Drogon's aid, yet here the dragon lay crippled by the storm. He pressed his other hand to his forehead, mind whirling. Even if he had all the maesters in the realm at his disposal, treating a dragon would be an unprecedented challenge. Alone, he was nearly helpless. But leaving Drogon here to die was unthinkable. Steeling himself, he spoke again, voice gentle yet firm. "I'll do what I can, but you must let me near." He did not know if the words mattered, or if the tone of his voice might soothe the dragon. Drogon's eye remained open, the slit pupil rolling to follow Jon's movements. With infinite care, Jon waded deeper into the water, closer to the injured wing. Even half submerged, the dragon's body dominated the ravine, an expanse of dark scale and muscle. The gashes in the membrane were wide, revealing raw, bloody tissue. Lightning or sharp rocks, he couldn't tell which had caused the worst of it. The edges of the tears were jagged, making it difficult to imagine a clean mend. Jon clenched his jaw, rummaging in his pack for any cloth. He had a small roll of linen bandages, meant for a man's arm or leg, but it was woefully inadequate for a dragon's wing. Still, it was all he had. Drogon let out a hiss when Jon reached up to press the cloth to a bleeding tear, but did not lash out. The dragon's flanks shuddered, each labored breath accompanied by a low wheeze. Jon felt desperation claw at him. He pressed down gently, trying to stanch the flow of blood. His hands quickly became slick with the dragon's hot lifeblood, mingling with the cold salt water. He murmured soft words, though he could hardly hear himself above the roar in his own ears. "Easy, easy now." The flow of blood slowed under the pressure of the cloth, but there were multiple wounds, each oozing. He tried to prioritize the worst. Ghost hovered at his side, occasionally sniffing or letting out a concerned whine. Jon realized he needed more cloth, anything that could function as a makeshift dressing. His own cloak was soaked and filthy, but he could tear strips from the hem. He moved carefully, wary of Drogon's massive head and tail. Any sudden movement from the dragon could crush him. As he tore the cloak into long strips and pressed them against the gashes, he risked a glance at Drogon's face. The dragon's eyelid was half closed, as though in pain or exhaustion. The rising and falling of Drogon's flank had grown shallow. A sense of dread crept over Jon. If the beast slipped into shock or lost too much blood, there would be little chance of survival. He worked faster, hands shaking in the cold. "Hold on," he muttered through chattering teeth. We've come this far, damn it. Each new strip, he bound around a torn section, tying it off clumsily. The black scales were slick, resisting any attempt to anchor the bandages. Blood seeped through, staining the cloth. He pushed lumps of seaweed aside, searching for stable purchase on the scaly ridges. It was a pitiful effort, but at least he could contain the worst of the bleeding until the dragon's own healing might set in. He kept talking, almost babbling as he worked. Remember how you carried her across the desert? Survived on whatever you could find. You're a survivor, Drogon. You are. This can't be the end. He was not sure if he spoke to the dragon, or to himself, or to the shade of Daenerys that loomed in every memory. The wind gusted, sending salt spray over his face, stinging his eyes. Time blurred. Eventually, the bleeding lessened, and Drogon lay still, breath irregular but unbroken. Jon surveyed the rough bandages with a sinking feeling, knowing it was a woefully inadequate patch for such a majestic creature. Still, it was better than nothing. He realized the day had advanced into a dim, brooding dusk. Clouds blocked the sun, leaving the ravine in deep shadow. The tide was inching upward, each new wave lapping closer to Drogon's tail. At high tide, this ravine might fill entirely with water. Jon needed to figure out how to move the dragon, or at least get the beast onto higher ground. He pulled back, panting with exertion and cold. Ghost stood watch, flicking water off his paws. "We need to get you out of here," Jon said to Drogon, voice raw. He reached out to place a hand gently on the dragon's scaled neck. Drogon shuddered, a faint growl emerging from deep in its throat. A broken hiss escaped the beast's maw. But there was no spark of flame. The dragon's well of strength, once bottomless, had run dangerously low. Jon gazed around the ravine. The rocks were steep, but perhaps a large enough creature could climb them if it could stand. The question was whether Drogon had the strength or the will to do so. The twisted wing looked nearly unusable, at least for now. Jon took a few steps backward, gesturing at Ghost to give the dragon room. "Come on," he murmured. "Up. We can't stay here. You'll drown if the water rises." He felt ridiculous, coaxing a dragon as if it were a stubborn horse. But there was no alternative. He raised his voice a notch. "Drogon, do you hear me? You must move." He slapped a hand against the scaly flank, ignoring the jolt of fear that coursed through him. "Get up." A rumble vibrated Drogon's body. One of the dragon's hind legs shifted, talons scraping against the submerged stones. The serpentine neck lifted slightly, and Drogon opened his mouth in a low roar of pain or frustration. Jon stepped back further, giving space. With a groan that reverberated through the ravine, Drogon tried to haul itself upright. Water sloshed in waves around the tail as the beast thrashed. The battered wing dragged limply, sending a fresh spurt of blood from one of the deeper tears, but the improvised bandages mostly held. The spines along Drogon's back bristled. Jon watched, breath held, as Drogon's front claws found purchase on a cluster of rocks. Inch by inch, the dragon heaved its massive body out of the shallows, splaying the healthy wing for balance. The twisted wing remained folded, half crumpled, quivering in pain. Jon scrambled out of the way, nearly slipping, as the enormous weight shifted. Rocks groaned and threatened to give way beneath the dragon's bulk. At last, Drogon managed to drag itself onto a shelf of stones above the waterline. The beast's chest heaved, every breath a labor, and it collapsed there, trembling. Jon let out a shaky breath, marveling at the creature's resilience. He approached cautiously, mindful that Drogon might be in an agonized, reactive state. But the dragon only lay panting, eyes glazed with pain and fatigue. The tide lapped mere feet below, but at least Drogon was no longer in immediate danger of drowning. Clouds churned overhead, and the day's light began to fade. Jon realized he needed shelter for the night, someplace nearby, but not so close that he would be crushed if Drogon rolled or lashed out. He also needed to keep an eye on the dragon. Thought of leaving Drogon alone, injured, in a rising tide made his stomach churn. He gathered his courage, stepping near the creature's head again. "I'll stay with you," he said quietly. "If you let me." Drogon's eye flicked toward him. No roar came, only a weary rumble. In that battered reflection, Jon saw a flicker of acceptance. Or perhaps he only saw what he wished to see. He dipped his head in a silent vow. Then he turned and whistled for Ghost, who padded over from his vantage on a higher rock. Tail lowered, expression watchful. The dire wolf looked from Jon to the dragon and back again, as though questioning the sanity of the entire situation. "We're in this together," Jon said, running a hand along Ghost's fur. Then he set about collecting what driftwood and scraps he could find washed up along the ravine's edge. The rain had tapered off, but everything was soaked. He managed to find a few pieces of half-dry timber lodged in a crevice under a large boulder. It was not much, but might be enough for a small fire. Dragging them to a spot a short distance from Drogon, he used a spark from his flint to coax a sputtering flame. The smoke was pungent, thick with salt and damp mold, but it was better than darkness. As night settled, Jon crouched by the fire, arms around his knees, shivering in his soaked clothes. He extended a hand toward Drogon's flank, feeling the dragon's warmth radiate through the chill. Ghost lay down near him, muzzle resting on paws. For a moment, the strangeness of the tableau struck Jon hard. There, in the flickering firelight, the last dragon and the last Targaryen, if indeed he was that, kept each other company on a broken shore. The hush of the night, aside from the lapping of water and Drogon's ragged breathing, made it feel as though they were all that remained in the world. He reached for his water skin, sipping the brackish liquid within. Hunger gnawed at him, but he had scant supplies left. He tore off a small piece of dried meat and chewed it in silence. Then he looked at Drogon's massive head. The scales near the jaw flecked with foam. The beast's breath was shallow, the eye half closed. Jon wondered if a dragon could succumb to fever or pneumonia. He recalled that Daenerys had once told him dragons rarely fell ill, that they were creatures of fire incarnate. But this land, and the raging storm, cared little for legends. "Rest," Jon murmured, though he knew Drogon might not understand. "I'll keep watch." It felt strange to speak so intimately to a beast that had once burned armies. But there, in the hush, battered and wounded, Drogon felt far less like an invulnerable terror, and more like a companion battered by fate. Jon felt a surge of fierce protectiveness, remembering how the dragon had guarded Daenerys, how it had curled around her with savage devotion. Perhaps, in some cosmic sense, it was Jon's turn to care for the creature she had loved. Thunder rumbled faintly in the far distance, but the storm did not return in earnest. Night pressed on, and the tide rose, but not high enough to reach the shelf where Drogon lay. Jon added bits of driftwood to the fire whenever it threatened to die, ignoring his exhaustion. Each time the dragon's breathing changed, or it shifted in discomfort, he jolted to attention, ready to offer what little aid he could. Ghost dozed lightly, ears twitching. In the darkest hours, Jon drifted into a restless half-sleep. Dreams flitted through his mind, memories of dragons in flight over Winterfell, the swirl of snow mixing with black wings. He heard Daenerys' voice calling his name, felt the burden of a crown that never fit. He tossed, waking when the horse snorted or the fire crackled unexpectedly. Drogon occasionally growled or groaned, a deep rumble of pain that tugged at Jon's heart. Each time he roused himself, murmuring soft reassurances, though it was all he could do. When dawn broke, pale and watery, the rain had stopped. Clouds still blanketed the sky, but a weak glow suffused the horizon. Jon rose stiffly, massaging the ache in his limbs. Ghost stood and stretched, shaking out his fur. Drogon lay in the same position, but the dragon's eye was open, and Jon thought the breathing sounded slightly stronger. He approached carefully, kneeling at the dragon's head. "Good morning," he said, feeling self-conscious, but forging ahead. "We made it through the night." Drogon blinked, the golden eye following Jon's movements. The battered wing lay folded at an odd angle, half bound in soaked cloth strips. The bleeding had mostly stopped, though fresh scabs ringed the tears. The bandages were crusted with salt and dried blood. A rough success, or at least no further calamity. That alone gave Jon a flicker of hope. He reached out to touch Drogon's neck, just behind the jaw. The scales there were warm, thrumming with life. The dragon let out a faint huff, not quite a growl, more a weary acknowledgement. Jon closed his eyes in relief, letting out a long breath. Perhaps if the dragon could heal enough to stand and walk, they could find a more suitable refuge. Then, given time and care, gods knew how, Drogon might fly again. Even the slimmest chance was worth fighting for. Rebuilding the wall seemed like a distant goal now, overshadowed by the immediate need to keep Drogon alive. But perhaps this was destiny, or penance. If the last living dragon was meant to help shape the future of the North, it would need Jon's help first. Yes, Jon whispered, letting the truth settle over him. We begin by healing. Together. He thought of Daenerys once more, picturing her proud smile when she spoke of the dragons as her children. He would do what he could, no matter how impossible. For her, for the North, for the memory of all they had lost. In the early morning light, he bowed his head against Drogon's scaled cheek, and for just an instant he could almost feel Daenerys' presence, an echo of warmth in the hush. The dragon breathed in, slow, measured rasps. Ghost padded closer, pressing his nose to Jon's shoulder. And so they remained, a tableau of wounded souls at the edge of the world, preparing for a new struggle that only they could undertake. Oh, Jay. Jon hunched against a cold wind that swept through the ravine, the early sun muted by low steel-gray clouds overhead. He ran a hand gently along Drogon's jawline, mindful of the curve of horn and scale. The dragon did not recoil. The eye that watched him gleamed with residual pain, but no immediate ire. Jon took that as a good sign. This was how it had to start, he thought. At the most desperate edge of the world, patching wounds in the wet brine, forging an uneasy trust. He rose, joints stiff from the dampness of the long night, and glanced about the jagged enclosure. Ghost was perched on a rock outcrop higher up, surveying the horizon with ears pricked. The horse, tethered upslope to a cluster of driftwood and stone, stamped anxiously at the smell of dragon blood in the air. There was plenty to unnerve any creature. Long ragged strips of shredded wing membrane still clung to Drogon's flank, the improvised bandages caked in dried salt. The water had receded with the tide, leaving behind an expanse of rocky pools that glinted in the dreary light. Jon sighed, looking at the battered dragon. The patches of scale that had peeled or cracked in the storm still oozed faintly. The creature's breathing was steadier, but a feverish shimmer played on Drogon's dark hide. The question of how to heal a dragon had no easy answer. In the realm's history, Daenerys was the only one he knew who had nurtured dragons back to health with success. But she was gone, and any lore that might have existed had scattered with the Targaryens. He only had his hands, a bit of cloth, and the willingness to try. The first challenge, he decided, was to bring Drogon to higher ground. The tide had gone out, but it would inevitably return. Here, the dragon risked being stranded, or worse, when the water rose again. If Jon could coax Drogon up onto the coastal shelf, there might be a chance to find a shallow cave or hollow for shelter. The battered wing likely needed days or weeks, not hours, to mend. With a stable space, Jon could gather herbs from whatever meager vegetation grew in these parts, or catch fish and boil the flesh. Dragons might prefer their kills raw, but Jon's experience told him that controlling the diet could sometimes help recovery. It felt like guesswork, but guesswork was all he had. He set to examining the route up from the ravine's stony floor to a ledge that rose just above a tumble of boulders. Slick ribbons of seaweed clung to the stones, making them treacherous. In some places, the rock was angled at a steep pitch. Drogon, for all his size, would still need careful navigation, especially injured. Jon imagined the dragon's massive weight shifting precariously on the uneven ground. One slip, and he might tear that wounded wing further or open new gashes. Jon would have to guide the creature, though how one guided a dragon was an open question. He paced along the base of the slope, searching for the least hazardous path. At its gentlest, the incline still forced him to climb with his hands on the stones. Loose gravel cascaded beneath his boots, and the roar of the sea echoed behind him, swirling in the gloom. Once at the top, he looked down at Drogon. The dragon lay partly on its side, panting softly. Ghost wandered in a half-circle near the beast, occasionally eyeing Jon as if uncertain how to help. The horse remained near the entrance to the ravine, flicking its tail. Jon scrambled back down, carefully picking his way. When he reached Drogon's flank, he rested a hand on one of the bandaged tears. The dragon hissed, not in aggression but discomfort. The edges of the cloth were stained a deep, brownish red. Jon peeled back a section to look at the wound. Some of it had started to scab, though the salt crusting likely irritated the exposed flesh. If only he had clean water. Some antiseptic salve. Instead, he had brackish pools and the knowledge that salt could disinfect, at least to a point. He gently pressed the cloth back, tying it in place with a fresh bit of torn cloak from his pack. He leaned close to Drogon's head and spoke quietly, as though reasoning with a wounded comrade. "We have to move you. The tide will come back. This place, it's no good. You'll freeze out here in the next storm." He rubbed a slow circle on the dragon's neck, aware of the muscle trembling beneath his touch. "You're strong, stronger than anyone. Just a bit further. We'll find a safer spot up there." He gestured to the rim of the ravine. Drogon's eye flickered, taking in the gesture, or so Jon liked to believe. A huff of warm air blew over Jon's shoulder as the dragon exhaled. With a grunt that seemed half protest, Drogon shifted. The wing twitched, and the creature winced, jaws parting in a spasm of pain. Jon moved aside, letting the dragon gather itself. He could only encourage from the sidelines. One of Drogon's foreclaws dug into the wet gravel, talons scraping until they bit into a cluster of rocks. The hind legs flexed, pushing the bulk of the body upward. Jon felt the ground vibrate under that immense weight. Clumps of pebbles dislodged from the ravine's wall, rattling down. The dragon, head lowered, dragged itself a few feet, then paused, sides heaving. Clearly, every movement tugged at the torn wing membrane. The bandaged section bled again, though not as profusely as before. Jon patted Drogon's flank gently. "Good," he murmured. "That's it." A few more lurching steps brought the dragon to the slope's base. Now the real test began, ascending the slippery boulders. Jon forged ahead, climbing partway, then looking back to see if Drogon would follow. Ghost hopped up, nimble on four paws, pausing on a ledge to watch them from above. Drogon snorted, as if mustering determination. The uninjured wing flared slightly for balance, though it still bore ragged edges from the storm's assault. With a growl that reverberated through Jon's chest, the dragon dug his claws into the incline. The first movement was awkward. Hind legs scrabbling, tail lashing the whetstones with enough force to send shards clattering. Jon feared the entire slope might collapse under that weight. But the boulders held, barely. Inch by inch, Drogon hauled himself upward. The torn wing dragged across the rock, leaving dark streaks. Jon flinched each time, certain it would tear anew. But the bandages stuck, if sloppily, keeping the membrane from flapping open. At one point, Drogon's talon slipped, and the dragon's mass slammed into the rocky slope. Ghost sprang aside, letting out a sharp bark. Pebbles bounced all around, and Jon nearly lost his footing. In that tense moment, he was certain Drogon might tumble backward and crash into the ravine below. But the dragon managed to brace. Every muscle along the scaled neck stood out in sharp relief as Drogon steadied himself. Jon felt a surge of admiration and guilt, wishing he could do more than simply stand there, urging the creature on. After a grueling climb that lasted many long minutes, Drogon finally hauled himself over the ridge onto a relatively flat shelf of stone. The dragon collapsed heavily, sides shuddering. The injured wing splayed at an awkward angle, but at least the threat of the tide was behind them. Here on the shelf, the sea stretched out below, choppy and gray, reflecting the sullen sky. Ghost padded over, sniffing at Drogon's flank, tail low. Jon approached, placing a hand on the dragon's shoulder, the scales there clammy with sweat. "Good," Jon said softly, breath misting in the chill air. "You made it." Drogon exhaled, a deep rumble in the chest that Jon took for exhausted relief. For a time, man and dragon remained there, breathing in tandem, each battered by the journey. Jon's cloak was torn nearly to rags, the strips used as bandages. His fingers ached with cold and tension. He glanced around, Judging the terrain, there was no immediate shelter overhead, just the open sky. But the land rose further inland. Perhaps if they pressed onward, they might find a half-collapsed cave or a cluster of stones that could break the wind. But Drogon needed a rest, and Jon was not eager to push the creature any further that day. He stood, shading his eyes from a faint glare of light peeking through a gap in the clouds. This vantage offered a long view of the coastline to the north. The remains of the shattered wall were visible in a ragged line of ice cliffs. Beyond that, the land stretched in rolling hills and windblown tundra. Far off, where the horizon blurred, he thought he saw the faint suggestion of mountains. Perhaps the old domain of the free folk, or uncharted wilderness where the White Walkers had once roamed. Jon remembered the terror of that war. Now, only the memory lived on. Yet he felt in his bones that the North was never entirely safe for long. That was why he'd come, after all. To rebuild, or at least to begin. But the immediate crisis was Drogon's survival. Jon turned his attention back to the dragon. The creature's breathing had settled into a raspy, but even rhythm. The gashes along the side and wing needed cleaning, though the best Jon could do was to gather driftwood and attempt to boil some water, if he could manage it at all. He would have to explore the nearby land, scavenge for supplies. The horse needed grazing, though the pickings would be slim. Jon approached the horse, stroking its mane. "You've done well," he murmured. "I'll try to find you something soon." He found a decent spot to tie the reins near a boulder where some scraggly weeds poked through. The horse sniffed at them dismally, uncertain. At least it was something. Jon checked on Ghost, who seemed content to roam, sniffing for small game or any trace of threat. Then Jon crouched next to Drogon again. The dragon's huge eye focused on him, reminding Jon that, beneath the wounds, Drogon was far from domesticated. The searing intelligence was still there. Jon cleared his throat. "I'll go look for anything that might help," he said quietly. "I won't go far." He touched Drogon's jaw once more, hoping the beast understood that he intended to return. Even if not, maybe it took some comfort in the gentle contact. Drogon didn't lash out. That was the best sign he could hope for. Leaving Ghost behind to watch over Drogon, Jon set out. He kept his sword at his hip, scanning the land for any sign of movement. Though the threat of White Walkers was gone, wild beasts still roamed, and desperate men might lurk anywhere. The wind bit at his cheeks, carrying the salt tang of the sea. He trudged up a gradual slope of shale and stunted grass, boots crunching. The vantage improved further as he ascended, revealing more of the shattered coastline. He came upon a jagged cleft in the rock, an indentation that might have once been a gully flowing with meltwater. Now it was mostly dry, though wet gravel indicated recent rainfall. He picked his way inside, noticing that boulders had tumbled down, forming a partial roof near the back. Inside, the air was marginally calmer. The wind muted. He paused, glancing around in the gloom. It was big enough for a few horses, or half a dozen men to shelter from a storm. Perhaps large enough for a wounded dragon to crawl into, if Drogon could manage. But the approach was narrow. Jon doubted the dragon's shoulders would fit easily through. Even if he could coax Drogon to try, there was a risk of collapse or deeper injury. Better, perhaps, to find something in the open that at least gave partial cover. He pressed on, eventually cresting a small rise. On the other side, the ground dipped into a depression ringed by weather-beaten willows. Judging by the dampness in the air, it might be a seasonal pond. If there was a place to gather water or find muddy patches of reeds, it would be here. As he drew nearer, he caught the scent of decay. Something had died recently. Ghost would have been more adept at sniffing out its source, but Jon pressed forward alone, scanning for any movement. In the hollow, he discovered the remains of a large creature, possibly a walrus or a sea lion dragged inland by wolves. Seabirds had picked it over, leaving only a scattering of bones and scraps of hide. He wrinkled his nose. This was hardly the bounty he'd hoped for. Still, the hide might be salvageable to cover Drogon's wounds, if it wasn't too rotted. Jon approached cautiously, sword half drawn in case any scavenger lingered. The smell was foul, but he forced himself to stoop and examine the hide. Much of it was rotted through, but a large patch near the back remained thick and relatively intact. With some effort, he cut away a piece of the hide using his dagger. His eyes watered from the stench. The best he could do was rinse it in the pond, though the water itself was stagnant, lined with a scum of algae and floating debris. He plunged the hide in, swishing it around, trying to remove the worst of the gore. The pond's surface rippled, disturbed, and the reflection of the sky broke into shards of murky color. When he pulled the hide free, it dripped foul brown water. It wasn't pleasant, but in dire circumstances it might serve as an additional barrier over Drogon's wounds, or at least help keep the wind from chilling them further. Jon realized that this was a desperate measure at best. He could just as easily cause infection with such filthy material, but he had nothing else. Standing there in the shallows, boots sinking in the mud, he took a moment to gather his resolve. He had never envisioned caring for a dragon like a wounded warhorse, improvising bandages out of a rancid hide and bits of cloak. And yet, a flicker of memory reminded him that Daenerys, too, had once wandered the Red Waste with little more than faith. She'd scrounged, improvised, persevered. He tried to summon that same determination. He slung the dripping hide over his shoulder and climbed out of the hollow, returning the way he'd come. The wind picked up, gusting from the north, driving a swirl of damp air across the stony ground. He soon saw the black silhouette of Drogon's body on the shelf, massive even in repose. The horse stomped nervously as Jon approached, but recognized him and settled. Ghost trotted to greet Jon, sniffing at the hide with a low growl of distaste. Jon approached Drogon quietly, letting the dragon see him. The golden eyes followed his movements. Drogon shifted position with a grunt, arching his neck. The scabs along the wing had cracked in places, and fresh blood crusted at the edges. Jon's stomach twisted at the knowledge that real healing might require days, if not weeks. Dragons were resilient, but Drogon still needed rest and protection from the elements. Perhaps he could find a spot further inland, away from the raw fury of the sea wind. Kneeling by the wing, Jon carefully slipped the piece of hide atop the bandages, trying to fasten it in place with leather straps torn from his gear. It was clumsy, but it formed a crude layer against the cold. Drogon hissed and flinched at every tug. Jon murmured soft apologies. He could feel the shudder of muscle beneath the scales, warmth that bordered on feverish. The downpour from the previous night and the salt-laced air did the wounds no favors. When at last he finished, he sat back on his heels, chest tight. He was exhausted. The sky overhead had begun to clear a little, revealing a narrow band of pale blue. The gulls circled in the distance, calling out their forlorn cries. Drogon's breathing steadied somewhat, eyes drifting half-closed. Perhaps the beast was simply drained enough to slip into a doze. Jon, too, felt the ache of weariness in every limb. He considered building a fire, but with limited dry fuel, he might not manage more than a few minutes of warmth. He decided to try anyway. Gathering what driftwood he found near the shelf's edge, he arranged it in a small pile, striking flint and steel. He coaxed a wavering flame to life. The smoke curled around them, carrying a salty tang. As the fire crackled, he fed it small pieces of wood. The warmth was minimal, but it gave him a spark of comfort. Ghost settled beside it, tucking his muzzle between his paws. The horse kept its distance, uninterested in flames and wary of the dragon's looming presence. Jon wondered if the steed would run off eventually, but for now, it seemed too drained or too loyal to do more than stomp about. He rummaged in his pack for food, finding only a couple strips of jerked venison and a stale heel of bread. Grimacing, he tore into the venison, then let the bread soak up a bit of water so it would be somewhat edible. He chewed in silence, gaze flicking to Drogon. The dragon's body rose and fell in shallow motions. Sunlight touched the black scales, revealing streaks of deep red highlights, the dried blood. A memory flickered through Jon's mind. The first time he saw Drogon up close in the dragon pit. The raw power that radiated from the creature. Now that power lay wounded, trusting Jon for lack of any other choice. The hours wore on, the sun cresting its zenith behind a thin veil of cloud. Jon dozed in small intervals, never fully resting. Always aware of Drogon's presence, he found himself listening to the soft rasp of the dragon's breaths, flinching at every pained rumble. Each time, he would set a hand on Drogon's scales, feeling the slow thunder of a heartbeat. He wondered if dragons understood comfort. By late afternoon, he decided to venture a short distance inland again, this time with Ghost, to search for anything resembling medicinal herbs. The Norse flora was sparse, but certain hardy plants grew in stony soil. Brown mosses, lichen that could be brewed into antiseptic washes, thistles that might staunch bleeding. Jon had scant knowledge of healing, gleaned mostly from the maesters at Castle Black, and from watching the wildlings treat injuries on the move. Still, anything was worth trying. Before leaving, he set a bowl-like piece of driftwood near Drogon's snout, filling it with water from his flask. Perhaps the dragon would lap at it if thirst demanded. Then, gripping his sword, he and Ghost set off. They climbed the slope again, the wind carrying a faint promise of dryness, though the clouds still hovered. Ghost sniffed at the ground, searching for trails. Small rodents or birds flitted between cracks in the rock. Farther inland, they found a patch of coarse grass, spotted with patches of purple-gray lichen. Jon knelt, carefully scraping some of the lichen into a pouch. He recognized it vaguely as something that, when boiled, produced a bitter but cleansing agent. The taste was foul. He had been forced to drink it once for a wound on the battlefield, but if it could help Drogon's injuries, he would do it. They wandered for another half-hour, discovering nothing else of immediate use. A few stunted shrubs clung to life near the lee of a boulder. Jon plucked some leaves, though he wasn't certain if they held medicinal value. The smell was pungent, reminiscent of pine tar. At least it might mask the dragons wound from carrion eaters, if such creatures dared approach. Circling back, he glimpsed something moving along a narrow ridge. A figure on foot, or perhaps an animal. He froze, signaling Ghost to stillness. The shape vanished behind a rise, leaving Jon uncertain whether it was merely a trick of the light. Bandit? Free folk? A bear? He waited, heart pounding, but the form did not reappear. Eventually, he moved on, deciding not to investigate. He had no wish for conflict. If there were men out here, they might be as desperate as he was. Best to keep their distance. Returning to Drogon, he found the dragon had shifted position, but not risen. The hide patches were still in place, though crusted with more dried fluid. The horse tossed its head at Jon's approach, and Ghost trotted ahead, quietly reassuming his vigil. Jon slid down to his knees near the small fire ring, stirring the ashes. He had enough damp wood to attempt a boil, if he got the flames going again. He painstakingly built the fire back up, then found a half-broken iron pot among his supplies. Really, just a battered cooking pot with a missing handle. He filled it with water from a small cask he'd taken off the horse, plus some fresh meltwater scooped from an icy puddle. It wasn't much, but he set it over the fire. While it heated, he crumbled the lichen into the pot, muttering a half-remembered instruction about letting it steep until the water darkened. Soon, a pungent odor rose, swirling around them in thick steam. Drogon stirred at the smell, releasing a soft growl of curiosity or irritation. Jon removed the pot from the flames and set it on the stones to cool slightly, blowing on the murky liquid. If he could apply it to the wounds, it might help cleanse, or at least prevent further rot. He dipped a bit of cloth in, then approached Drogon's flank carefully. The dragon rumbled. Jon whispered in a calming tone, "This will sting, I know, but it might help." He pressed the soaked cloth gently against the bandaged tears. Drogon jerked, letting out a short hiss, but did not unleash flame. Jon thanked whatever luck or bond stayed the dragon's wrath. With slow, deliberate movements, he cleaned the edges of the wound, wiping away dried blood and brine. The water quickly stained a deeper crimson-brown dot. Each dab made Drogon flinch, the spines along his neck twitching. Jon murmured reassurance, though he himself felt a hollow fear that it was all too little too late. Still, after several minutes, he managed to mop away the worst of the grit. The bandages needed replacing, but he had only so many strips of cloth. He reused some that were less soaked in gore, rinsing them in the leftover solution. Then he secured them again, tucking the edges beneath that half-rotted hide. Ghost watched with a rapt intensity, as if expecting Drogon to snap at Jon any moment. The horse snorted in the background, evidently disapproving of the smell. When it was done, Jon slumped against a rock, lightheaded. The tasks demanded by this caretaking were so simple: clean the wound, keep the dragon warm, gather supplies, and yet each step felt monumental. He chewed another strip of venison, gazing at the western sky. Evening approached. The wind had shifted again, carrying a biting chill. This region was harsh even in mild weather. A single snowstorm could kill man or beast if caught unprepared. He thought back to the fishermen's huts near Eastwatch, where he had spent a night not so long ago. Their simple existence seemed almost luxurious compared to huddling against bare rocks with a wounded dragon. Yet no one forced him to remain. He could have turned back, abandoned this mad quest. But in his heart, he knew that was not an option. Somewhere in the memory of Daenerys' dream burned a spark. The wall must stand. Humanity needed its watch, and if there was any hope of forging that watch anew, it lay in the fury of a dragon's flame. As dusk came on, he built the fire higher, feeding it scraps of driftwood and whatever brush he'd gathered. The temperature dipped sharply, and the sky took on a bruise-like hue, clouds deepening overhead. He worried about another storm. Though no lightning flickered yet, Drogon dozed fitfully. Sometimes the dragon would shift, letting out a groan of discomfort, and Jon would re-wet the cloth in the bitter brew, applying it gently. The mere act of touching a dragon's scales without losing a hand or being roasted alive felt surreal, a testament to how dire the situation was. Eventually, the night grew black, broken only by the flicker of firelight and a faint glow around the horizon. Jon shared a portion of dried oats with the horse, though it hardly made a difference in the animal's hunger. Ghost sat at a vantage point overlooking the sea, occasionally sniffing the air, ever alert for threats. Jon tried to rest, leaning against Drogon's flank for warmth. The rhythmic swell of the dragon's breathing was an odd comfort, reminiscent of lying next to Ghost in winter nights gone by. His mind wandered, recalling the promise he'd made to himself, and to whatever remains of Daenerys existed in the realm of memory, to rebuild the wall. To do so, he must first see Drogon through this crisis. Perhaps in time, the dragon would trust him enough to follow. Then the question arose: how could one direct a dragon's flame precisely to fuse and reforge miles of broken ice? He remembered the legends, how the Targaryen dragons had helped build the first Red Keep. Fire-melted stone, aided in forging moats and ramparts. Ice, though, was different. Melt it too much, and it would collapse. One needed cunning and skill. Maybe the maesters had an answer in their old tomes, though the maesters were far from here, and none would rush to assist a disgraced crow and a monstrous creature. Somewhere in the middle of these spiraling thoughts, Jon drifted into a shallow sleep. He dreamed of soaring over white plains, Drogon's wings beating the air, the cracked wall rising in the distance. In the dream, it glowed with an otherworldly light, as though the magic of old still lingered in the ice. He thought he saw shadowy figures on the parapets, Night's Watch brothers, wildlings, men of the north, all standing as one. The dream blurred, shifting into the memory of Daenerys on the shores of Dragonstone, her silver hair dancing in the sea breeze. She reached out a hand to him, but the tide pulled her away, vanishing into the horizon. He awoke with a jolt, heart pounding. Night pressed around him like a silent cloak. The fire had burned low, glowing embers casting faint shadows on the rocks. Drogon's flank lifted and fell, still in the same spot. Jon rubbed his face, wishing for better rest, but there was no time to indulge. Carefully, he rose, adding a bit more wood to keep the coals alive. The wind had calmed somewhat, leaving a stillness in its wake. He checked the dragon's wounds again by the dim red glow. The bandages felt dry in places, stiff with dried fluids. The deep gashes were partially scabbed, though the edges still looked angry and inflamed. He pressed the back of his hand to one of the exposed scales near the wing joint. Heat radiated outward, a sign of either healing or infection. Sighing, he rummaged for the leftover brew in the iron pot. Cold and sludgy, it smelled even worse than before, but it was all he had. He He soaked a rag and gingerly pressed it to the edges of the largest tier. Drogon shifted, letting out a low snarl. Jon hushed him softly. "Only a little more," he whispered. "Easy." The dragon quieted, though the muscles remained tense under Jon's hand. He repeated this process for each wound, washing and re-wetting. By the time he finished, the night had edged deeper toward morning. Ghost padded over, yawning widely. Jon guessed that a few hours remained until dawn. He longed for sleep, but concern for Drogon kept him vigilant. He was no maester, but he suspected the next day or two would be critical. If the infection spread, there would be little he could do. If Drogon rallied, then perhaps the threat would diminish. Even so, weariness claimed him once again. He drifted off in a half-sitting position, leaning against a rocky outcropping near the dragon. If Drogon moved in the night, Jon would wake from the scrape of scales on stone, or the exhalation of fire. When dawn arrived, a pallid light crept over the horizon, revealing thin columns of fog snaking through the coastline. Jon woke with a stiff neck, blinking grit from his eyes. Drogon was awake as well, lifting his head in a slow, deliberate motion, as if testing the weight of it. The golden eyes looked clearer, more focused. Jon braced himself, uncertain if the dragon's renewed alertness would bring hostility. Instead, Drogon only emitted a low rumble that vibrated through the rocky shelf. Jon risked a small smile. "You're better today," he said softly. There was a quiet in the dragon's demeanor that he interpreted as less agony, more fatigue. Ghost trotted up, tail waving in a subtle greeting. The horse, for its part, stood a ways off, muzzle near a tuft of grass. Jon crouched, stretching his arms overhead to chase the stiffness from his muscles. Then he busied himself gathering more driftwood to coax the fire back to life. He was hungry, thirstier still. The water supply ran low, and he needed to find fresh sources. The only good option was to climb inland again, to that hollow or beyond, and search for better pools or streams. He approached Drogon, one hand extended in a cautious gesture. "I need to find water," he told the beast, half laughing at himself for speaking as if the dragon would protest. "I'll come back, just hold on." Drogon snorted, the exhalation warm on Jon's face. The dragon's gaze flicked to the horizon, perhaps registering the shift in the weather. The clouds had thinned slightly, but the day was cold, and the sea still hammered the rocks below. Jon patted Drogon's flank as gently as he could. Then he whistled for Ghost, who padded over, ears perked. They set out again. This time, Jon led the horse, hoping to carry more supplies if he found anything useful. The path inland had become slightly more familiar. He moved at a steady pace, though the climb was still slick in places. The gulls shrieked overhead, searching the tide pools for scraps. Occasional bursts of sunlight revealed the battered terrain. After a half hour or so, Jon spotted a depression in the rock that might channel rainwater. Drawing closer, he found a small pool fed by a trickle from the slope above. He crouched, testing it with a cupped hand. The water was fresh, though tinged with sediment. Thirst overcame caution, and he drank, feeling the grit against his teeth, but welcoming the coolness that soothed his parched throat. The horse nudged forward, also seeking a drink. Jon let it slurp its fill. He searched for something to carry more water back. In his pack, he had only a single skin and a battered flask. He filled both and considered scrounging for larger containers, perhaps hollowed driftwood or a clay jug from some long-abandoned settlement. Without that, he might have to make multiple trips. A pang of anxiety struck him as he imagined Drogon alone, possibly trying to move or being discovered by strangers. He picked up his pace. Ghost ventured off, sniffing among the rocks. Jon followed, noticing the direwolf's tail wagging in a curious pattern. When he rounded a boulder, he found Ghost pawing at something half buried in scree. A tarnished metal ring caught the morning light. Jon knelt, brushing aside debris to reveal what looked like a battered crate or chest, partially collapsed by time and weather. The ring was attached to a lid or door. With effort, he pried it open, revealing a damp interior that stank of rot. Inside were fragments of cloth, some rusted metal implements, and a few lumps of something unidentifiable. Likely old rations or supplies from a traveling party that passed this way years ago. The metal items were corroded almost beyond use, though one piece resembled a small pot or bucket. John carefully extracted it, wincing as flakes of rust fell away. But it still seemed capable of holding liquid if used gently. He carried the corroded bucket to the pool and tested it. Water seeped slowly through tiny holes, but if he plugged them with cloth, it might hold long enough to get back. He used a strip of linen and pressed it into the largest gap. The fix was crude, but might work in the short term. After filling the bucket, he balanced it carefully, motioning for the horse to remain still. By the time he returned to the shelf where Drogon rested, his arms and back ached from the tension of trying not to spill the water along the rocky route. The sun had risen higher, though the cold persisted. John exhaled in relief when he saw Drogon still lying there, alive, no sign of disturbance. He hurried to set the bucket and water skins down near the fire pit. Then he knelt at the dragon's side, scanning the wounds. A faint odor of rot lingered, but the old bandages still held. The larger tears appeared no worse than before. Drogon gazed at him with that intense stare, then shifted the good wing slightly, stirring a gust of wind that ruffled John's hair. The dragon's breath quickened, the chest expanding in a shallow pant. John dipped a cloth in the water, wiping away salt crust from Drogon's scales. Steam rose as the dragon's body heat was far greater than the frigid air. The scabs looked raw, some weeping a thin fluid. John wished for a true healer, or even a stable hand who had more skill in treating large beasts. But he was alone. He refilled his cooking pot with water, setting it over the fire, adding the last of his lichen scrap. While it heated, he spoke in a low voice to Drogon, nonsense words about survival, about the old days, about Daenerys. It soothed him, if nothing else. The water reached a simmer, and he dumped fresh cloth, wrung it out, then carefully pressed it to the worst gash. Drogon squirmed, a rumbling protest in the throat. John felt hot breath against his arm, but it was not a threat so much as a complaint. The day passed in this slow labor. John fed the horse handfuls of dry grasses he scavenged from a sheltered pocket. Ghost brought a small hair in his jaws at one point, dropping it near John. Surprised, John nodded gratefully, taking the hair. He cleaned it with rough efficiency, saving the innards for bait if needed. The rest he set aside to roast lightly. But a thought occurred. Might Drogon benefit from food? Dragons typically hunted fresh kills, but the beast was in no condition to fly or chase. John carved out a chunk of raw meat from the hair. Approaching Drogon's snout, he held it out. The dragon's nostrils flared, an expression of faint disgust or disinterest, and he turned his head away. John laid the meat near Drogon's mouth anyway, in case the dragon changed his mind. He returned to the fire, skewering the remaining flesh for himself. A meager meal, but the first real hot food he'd had in days. The smell reminded him painfully of the feasts at Winterfell, long ago, where he and his family shared laughter by the hearth. Those days felt like another life. Late afternoon painted the sky with a subdued palette of pewter and dull gold. The sea below churned, white caps visible from the high vantage. John checked Drogon's wounds again, applying another rinse of the bitter lichen solution. The dragon tolerated it with stony patience. Occasionally, Drogon's gaze flicked to John's face, as though perplexed by this small human's persistent care. As evening neared, John noticed Drogon sniffing at the chunk of raw meat he left. With a slow, almost tentative motion, the dragon extended his forked tongue, drawing the morsel into his jaws. A quiet crunch followed, then swallowing. John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It was a small sign that Drogon retained his appetite, a vital factor for healing. Maybe in time they could find larger prey, but John would rather not risk leaving Drogon alone for too long, chasing after game that might not exist in this sparse region. That night, the wind returned, keening around the rocks. John huddled with Ghost and the horse, trying to keep the fire alive. Drogon dozed fitfully, sometimes shifting in ways that jolted John awake with alarm, half expecting a spurt of flame. But the dragon's flames never came. At least the weather held, no storms battered them, and the sunrise arrived with a hint of color in the east. By the third day, the worst of the bleeding had stopped. The scabs grew thicker, and though infection threatened, Jon's continuous rinsing appeared to keep it in check, unless the deeper tissue concealed unseen rot. Drogon showed signs of restlessness, occasionally testing his limbs, stretching the good wing. When the creature tried to move the injured wing, a growl of pain echoed across the shelf. Jon would rush forward, urging calm. They were not out of danger, but it was progress. Between tending the wounds, gathering water, and scrounging for any morsel of food, Jon barely found time to sleep. Occasionally, he thought of the bigger picture. The wall half in ruins waiting beyond the horizon. He wondered if rumor of Drogon's presence might filter to distant ears. If travelers or wildlings might come searching. A single dragon could change the North's fortunes. Then again, if they discovered Drogon injured, it could draw poachers, men who might see a chance to kill a dragon for glory or to avenge old grievances. Jon had to be watchful. At midday, Drogon stirred, lifting himself onto his forelegs. Jon stood back, heart thumping, uncertain if the dragon planned to shift position. With a groan that might have been frustration, Drogon lumbered upright, supporting most of his weight on the uninjured side. The injured wing drooped, tears bound by a ragged cloth and hide. Jon stood aside, letting the dragon test his strength. Drogon shook droplets of condensation from his scales, then took a halting step forward. Another. The movements were stiff, pained, but the dragon did not collapse. A good sign. Jon followed at a respectful distance, sword sheathed. He glanced down at Ghost, who watched with ears pricked. Drogon paced in a slow half-circle, tail dragging a shallow groove in the loose pebbles. The creature's head swung side to side, sniffing the air, perhaps catching the scent of potential prey, or just reacquainting himself with the world after days of immobilization. Jon couldn't help but feel a rush of relief. The dragon was recovering, at least enough to stand and move. Drogon turned his gaze on Jon, that molten stare intense. Then, with a snort, the dragon limped a few more steps, heading closer to the edge of the shelf that overlooked the sea. Jon tensed, worried Drogon might try to take flight too soon, but the beast merely stopped at the precipice, peering out at the crashing waves below. A keening sound emerged from deep within Drogon's throat, almost lamenting. Jon felt a pang, recalling how the dragon once soared freely, carrying denaries across deserts and seas. Now it stood battered and bound in makeshift bandages. Jon approached slowly. "You'll fly again," he whispered, voice catching. "We'll make sure of it." Was that arrogance? Naivete? He didn't care. The thought of this proud creature forever grounded felt like another tragedy in a realm that had endured too many. Drogon lifted his head, the spines along his neck rippling. A faint shimmer of sunlight glinted off the black scales. Jon stepped to the dragon's side, though not too close to the edge, and gazed out at the coastline. The broken remnants of the wall stretched north and south, marking the boundary of a world once held safe. Though the southern lands had breathed a collective sigh of relief after the wars, Jon knew the north never truly rested. If new threats emerged, who would guard against them? A wave of determination swept him. He would see Drogon through this ordeal. Then, if the gods favored them, they would begin the impossible task of rebuilding the wall. Step by step, stone by stone, or ice block by ice block, forging it anew with dragonfire, mending the tears in the shield that protected the realm of men. For those who had fallen, for those who still lived, for the promised Daenerys had believed in once, an unbroken future, a land shielded from the horrors of the long night. Drogon exhaled, turning his head toward Jon, nostrils flaring. There was a weariness in the dragon's posture, but also the faint echo of a kingly bearing. It reminded Jon of the times he'd seen Rhaegal, or Viserion, perch on the ramparts of Dragonstone, surveying the sea with regal indifference. For the first time since that fateful day in King's Landing, Jon felt a stirring of hope that he might be forgiven by this mighty beast, or at least tolerated enough to work together. He placed a hand lightly on Drogon's shoulder. The dragon did not recoil. Rather, the golden eye slid half shut, a rumbling purr or growl reverberating in its chest. John forced a small smile. "This is just the beginning," he said, voice rough. "We have far to go." Stepping back, he regarded the makeshift bandages. They had served their purpose, but were now crusted in grime. He would need to reapply fresh wrappings. Perhaps, if he ventured further into the wilderness, he might find better supplies, cleaner fabric, herbal poultices that could truly accelerate the healing process. Even without a maester, rumor held that certain northern tribes knew remedies lost to the citadels. But that would require leaving Drogon alone for longer than John felt comfortable. Would the dragon remain here, or try to follow, or attempt flight? He turned to Ghost, who stood a short distance away, tail swishing. "We'll search again tomorrow," John decided aloud. "Nearer to the forest's edge, if any forest remains. I won't go so far that I can't return by nightfall." Ghost cocked his head in acknowledgement, as if comprehending the plan. The rest of the day slipped by in cautious routine. John gathered more water, checked the stale pond for fish, finding none, and returned to feed Drogon small portions of whatever scavenged meat he had. The dragon accepted it more willingly now, swallowing with minimal complaint. Each morsel would help regain strength. The wound cleaning process was slightly easier, as Drogon tolerated John's touch, though puffs of steam hissed between the dragon's teeth whenever the cloth pressed too hard. Ghost watched, sometimes letting out a low whine in sympathy. At dusk, John coaxed the horse over, wanting to ensure the beast wouldn't wander off in the night. The horse snorted and danced sideways at Drogon's proximity. John murmured calming words, tying it to a protrusion of rock near the back of the shelf, as far from the dragon as possible. He had to trust the dragon not to incinerate the horse out of sheer annoyance. So far, Drogon had shown no interest in that. Perhaps understanding the horse was not wild game, or perhaps the dragon was too injured to bother. Either way, John accepted it gratefully. That night, they huddled around the fire once more. The starless sky pressed down, and a half-moon peeked through a rift in the clouds, casting a pale glow on the sea. Drogon lay with his neck curled around his flank, the injured wing folded carefully. If not for the rustling of bandages and the occasional pained grunt, one might almost imagine it was a peaceful camp. But Joan's mind churned. In a few more days, the dragon might be well enough to travel, though flying was still out of the question. They would need to find more robust shelter, especially before true winter set in. From there, who knew how the great beast might respond? Maybe Drogon would sense a call in the north, or maybe the dragon would depart, free at last. And what of Joan's vow to rebuild the wall? He pushed these thoughts aside, letting exhaustion drag him down. The following morning dawned with a gusty wind. John rose stiffly, checked Drogon's wounds again, and offered the dragon the last of his dried meat. Ghost helped bring down a gull, though it was more feathers than flesh. Still, Drogon snapped it up in a single gulp, ignoring the tangle of wings. Some nourishment was better than none. John resolved to make a longer excursion that day. If he could find even a hint of civilization, a small encampment of wildlings, a ruin where supplies might be stored, he might gather cloth or grain, or anything to aid Drogon's recovery. He laid a hand on the dragon's side, speaking quietly. "I must go. I'll be back before sunset if I can. Rest." Drogon blinked, tail twitching. It was not exactly permission, but there was no protest. John packed his meager gear, whistled to Ghost, and untied the horse. Leading it carefully across the rocky terrain, he headed inland. Each step took him deeper into the silent north, where the wind moaned across bare ridges, and the stunted vegetation whispered secrets of old. Hours passed. He discovered more scattered pools of water, a few scrawny rabbits that Ghost managed to chase down. He found rocky outcrops and half-collapsed caverns, but no sign of living men, no caches of supplies left behind. The wind carried only the lonely cry of birds and the rustle of shifting stones. By midday, fatigue weighed on him. He paused near a cluster of standing stones, likely the remnants of some ancient tribe's marker or ritual site. The stones stood waist-high, arranged in a rough circle, spattered with lichen. Here, he let the horse graze on sparse patches of grass, while he gnawed at a leftover rabbit bone, the meager meal tasting of old iron. After resting, he pressed on, determined to search just a bit farther before returning. The terrain sloped downward into a shallow valley. As John descended, he caught sight of something incongruous, a narrow wisp of smoke rising from behind a hillock. Heart pounding, he dismounted and motioned for Ghost to stay close. Could it be a campfire? He approached slowly, leading the horse by the reins. Conscious of the crunch of gravel underfoot, Ghost stayed beside him, ears twitching. As they neared the crest, the smell of wood smoke became unmistakable. John peered over the ridge and spotted a small encampment nestled in a hollow. A single lean-to made of driftwood and tattered hides. 2 figures crouched by a fire. His mind raced. Were they wildlings? Fisher folk? Bandits? He could not tell at this distance, but caution dictated a stealthy approach. He tethered the horse out of sight, then motioned for Ghost to circle around. Creeping forward, he pressed himself low to the ground. The wind rustled the short grasses, covering some of the sound of his movement. As he drew nearer, he saw that one figure was a woman, hair streaked with gray, wearing a patchwork of furs. The other, a boy of perhaps 12 or 13, thin as a reed. They seemed to be cooking something in a small clay pot over the fire, the boy stirring listlessly. No signs of weapons, save a single spear leaning against a rock. John hesitated. He had no desire to rob them or cause fear. They had cloth or supplies, perhaps they would trade. Yet revealing himself as a stranger could provoke panic. He took a breath, stood up slowly, hands visible. Ghost followed his lead, ears pricked, but not aggressive. "Ho there," John called, stepping down the slope. "I mean no harm." The woman startled, clutching at the boy. The spear remained propped against the rock, though she glanced at it nervously. She let out a husky shout in the old tongue of the free folk, or a dialect close to it. Then she switched to a rough version of the common tongue. "Who are you? Keep your distance." John raised both hands. "I'm just a traveler," he said. "I have no quarrel with you. I seek cloth, bandages, anything." "I can trade." She frowned, eyeing his leathers and the black sword at his hip. The boy peered from behind her, wide-eyed. John could see they were lean with hunger, but not starving, somehow surviving in these harsh lands. Their pot emitted a thin steam, maybe a stew of roots or boiled fish. "Nothing to trade," the woman snapped. "Go away." John swallowed, gesturing at Ghost to stay behind him. "Please. My horse is up the ridge. I have a little coin, though I suspect it might mean little to you. Or I can help with hunting. I only need cloth, clean if possible, and if you know of any herbs for infection." He trailed off, uncertain how much to reveal about Drogon. The woman exchanged a wary glance with the boy. She made a hissing sound in her throat, as if suspicious of Southerners, but the desperation in John's voice gave her pause. After a tense moment, she jerked her head toward her lean-to. "We have some scraps. Not much. Show us what you offer in return." John exhaled relief. Carefully, he reached into his pouch, producing the few coins he still carried, a couple of silver stags, a battered copper piece. He also had a small hunting knife that might be more useful. He laid them in the open palm of his glove. "This is all I have," he admitted, "but I can help gather more wood or catch some game." The boy crept forward, eyeing the coins. "You're a watch crow?" he asked timidly, noting John's dark attire. "Or used to be." John managed a half-smile. "Once," he said. "A lifetime ago, it seems. Now I'm just John, and this is Ghost." The boy gazed at the direwolf, curiosity flickering across his thin face. The woman still eyed John with distrust. At length she stood, rummaging through a worn sack near their pallet of furs. She pulled out a few lengths of cloth, frayed at the edges, but relatively clean. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added a handful of dried plants tied in a small bundle. "Herbs," she said curtly. "Boil them, use the water on wounds. They fight rot. That's all we have to spare." John accepted them with gratitude. He laid the coins in her hand, then offered the hunting knife's hilt for her to examine. "Will this help?" She eyed it, then nodded, slipping it into her belt. The boy continued staring at Ghost, a flicker of excitement behind his wariness. Jon stood, feeling the tension still thick in the air. "Thank you," he said softly. "You've helped more than you know." The woman nodded brusquely. "You'll find little else out here. Folks stay away from the Broken Coast. Bad omens." Her gaze flicked to the horizon. "Some say a dragon roams these skies. I'd not linger if I were you." Jon swallowed, forced to maintain a neutral expression. "A dragon?" he echoed, feigning ignorance. "That sounds like a tale." She shrugged. "Might be, but men have heard roars in the night. Some vow they've seen a shadow cross the moon." Her eyes narrowed. "If you came for that beast, you've come to die." Jon dipped his head, hiding the tumult in his chest. "I'll keep that in mind, thank you. May the gods watch over you." The boy stepped forward suddenly, holding out a small wooden talisman shaped like a crude wolf's head. "Take this," he asked, voice breaking. "For luck?" Jon hesitated, touched by the gesture. He accepted the talisman gently, feeling the rough carving under his thumb. "Thank you," he said, meeting the boy's gaze. "I'll treasure it." A moment later, the woman ushered the boy back, clearly wanting Jon gone. Jon gave a final nod, then retreated, calling Ghost to his side. When he retrieved the horse, his heart felt lighter. The cloth and herbs were exactly what he needed, and the chance encounter reminded him that people still inhabited these lands. Perhaps they too needed protection if a wounded dragon might lash out, or if some other threat emerged. He made haste, eager to return to Drogon. The day wore on, and the light began to fade by the time he descended the rocky slopes toward the shelf. Relief washed over him at the sight of the black shape still resting there. The massive wings folded in an awkward arc. Jon tethered the horse near a stunted bush and hurried to Drogon's side. The dragon shifted, releasing a low rumble of recognition or warning. Jon raised a placating hand. "It's all right. I found supplies. We'll clean those wounds properly now." Ghost padded up behind him, carrying the scent of the encampment. Jon set down the handful of cloth strips. Some were linen, some wool. They were meager, but far better than the dirty, ragged bandages. Then he showed the dragon the small bundle of dried herbs. Drogon snorted, unimpressed. Chuckling despite himself, Jon said, "I doubt they smell nice, but they might help." He wasted no time building a fresh fire with the driftwood had collected and setting water to boil in his pot. While waiting for the bubbles, he unwrapped the existing bandages from Drogon's wing, mindful of every wince and growl. The wounds beneath were painful to behold. Red, ragged flesh puckered around scabs, and pockets of fluid glistened ominously. But it was not as putrid as Jon had feared. He exhaled relief. Tearing the cloth into useful lengths, he soaked them in the herb water once it had steeped. A bitter aroma filled the air. The woman had mentioned these herbs fought rot. Jon hoped she was right. He pressed the warm, infused cloth to the wounds, and Drogon hissed, twitching the battered wing. Jon murmured apologies and reassurance. With gentle persistence, he dabbed away the crusted residue, pausing now and then to rinse and reapply. After a while, he could see some improvement. At least the infected areas oozed less. Finally, he bound the wing with a fresh set of wrappings, layering the wool strips. They were not long enough to cover everything, so he used the linen pieces to reinforce the edges. When done, he sat back, sweat dripping down his brow despite the chill. Drogon rumbled softly, shifting his weight. It was a laborious process, but a necessary one. Jon realized hunger gnawed at him again, so he set about cooking a bit of rabbit from Ghost's latest catch. It was meager, but he'd grown used to small meals. Watching him, Drogon let out an impatient huff. Jon tossed a chunk of raw meat toward the dragon's jaws. Drogon accepted it more readily now, swallowing it in one gulp. "That's the spirit," Jon said, rubbing his throbbing shoulder. "Eat, heal, and soon we'll see about that wing." Night drew close, the firelight dancing across the dragon's scales. Jon pulled out the boy's wooden talisman, turning it over in his hands. The crudely carved wolf's head reminded him of the stark sigil, of Winterfell's ancient godswood. of all the old ties that bound him to the north. He closed his fingers around it, whispering thanks to the nameless boy. In that moment, he felt a connection, a reminder that the north was not just a frozen wasteland, but a home for those who had the courage to remain. He tucked the talisman into his belt pouch, then gazed up at Drogon. The dragon's eye caught the reflection of the fire, a molten gold ringed by black. Jon felt certain that somewhere in there lay a glimmer of comprehension, that Drogon sensed he was not alone. Together they might reshape the destiny of the North, or they might fail spectacularly. But the path was set. Jon lay back against the cold stone, gazing at the stars that emerged in thin patches between drifting clouds. He thought of Daenerys again, her fierce determination, her unwavering resolve in the face of the impossible. If she were here, she'd either laugh at his rough attempts at doctoring or help him refine them. He closed his eyes, imagining her voice. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of salt. Drogon let out a soft rumble, and Ghost yawned, resting his head on Jon's leg. The horse dozed, occasionally flicking its tail. In that fragile peace, Jon felt the stirrings of hope, fragile yet real. Tomorrow, he whispered to the darkness, we'll keep going. A new day would bring more trials. Searching for better shelter, more thorough healing, perhaps more encounters with the wild folk. But in that quiet night, with the dragon's heartbeat rumbling through the stone beneath him, Jon felt something almost like faith. If they persevered, if they fought the odds, there might come a time when the wall would stand again, a testament to all who had sacrificed. And in that future, the realm might remember that in the darkest of nights, a wounded dragon and a weary man found each other at the edge of the world and forged a flame of hope for all that lay ahead.